the track. Okay, so good morning, afternoon and evening, everybody. I'm going to provide a quick introduction and overview of the track 4W, a research agenda for public transport, and it's based on the Routledge Handbook of Public Transport. And there's a photograph in the bottom right-hand corner of the book, which was edited by Corinne Mulley, John Nelson, and Stephen Ison. I'm Steve Ison, so hello. Corinne is with us. John is not. He's in Sydney, and it's 5 in the morning, so he will join later, but not for this particular session because it's too early for him. It's a slightly different session, I think, this to the others that are a part of the conference, in that it is based on the outputs from this book, the Public Transport Handbook, and a number of the contributors are here today and will either be facilitating the sessions, or will be presenting directly, or will be giving recordings. So we're pleased to be part of the Bridging Transportation Researchers Conference, and welcome those that are with us. Roger, do you want to move on? The second slide. Yeah, we thought we'd say a little bit about the track. Clearly, public transport is a collective transport accessible to the general public, often provided on fixed routes, be that on road or on track, and it involves different modes: trains, trams, bus rapid transit, light rapid transit, coaches, local buses, aircraft, taxis, and Uber and the relative new forms. There's a quote there which goes back quite some time, but we thought that was relevant, and that's in the preface to the book, because transport pervades most areas, and of course it's the theme of the conference. It is the conference essentially, but there's no escape from transport. Transport, more than any other industry, has always been in the public eye and always will be. Almost every transport decision is a public issue. And that's as true today as it was 50 years ago. And it's certainly true in terms of public transport. And as I've said, as we said, then the track seeks to contribute to that debate. And the handbook does that also. As it says there, it was published in 2021, so it's only been out a short period of time. I don't want to do a selling pitch, but I just want to thank a couple of people. So on the next slide, Roger, there is a thanks to Guy Loft at Routledge, who had the foresight to commission the book in the first place. I want to thank the authors, of which there are a number here, including Roger, who provided of their wisdom, intellect, information and experience to form the book, which was excellent. We as editors have done the least, essentially, but we hope that we will inspire both students, academics and practitioners, both now and in the future. The next slide just says a little bit about public transport. It's problem rich. There are a breadth of issues. It's one where there is rapid change, both in delivery and management, in the regulatory framework, in the market structure, in the levels of technology and technological change. There are a range of issues: sustainability, productivity, an aging population that utilizes the public transport. And it's at the interface between economics, the environment, land use, and the social aspects, essentially. And of course, it's been subject, as lots of things have, to COVID, and that's impacted clearly on the public transport provision. Socially distancing of individuals, wearing masks, working from home, furlough, have all impacted on the use and demand, and therefore the profitability of public transport. So it's a complex area with lots of issues and lots of problems, but lots of challenges, but also lots of optimistic areas. The next slide basically gives you a little bit about makeup of the book, the fact that it is 43 chapters, 63 authors. from 19 countries. And it was divided into 6 sessions: the policy context, the modal settings, the public transport environment, the delivery issues, smart card data issues, planning, and the future. So essentially that's it. And that's the way in which we're going to structure this track today, although not in the order in which you've got it there. So the final slide actually gives that. And there we have the 6 sessions. Roger is going to kick off in a minute with the policy context. But because of the timeline, Maria is doing the second one on delivery issues. Matthew's with us. He's looking at modal setting. But that should be Roberto. Roberto's looking at the future. Jan-Dirk, the environment, and Barbara Yen at data and the planning area. So all sections are covered, but not in the order in which they are in the book. So we hope you enjoy this track. We hope we can stimulate some debate. We hope you go away with some lessons. And Roger, I'll pass on to you.
Okay, I'll stop sharing that one. And I'll start when I can get back to this sharing again. About the policy context, and this is about making public transport relevant. It seems to me that we're going through a very interesting time period now, not least assisted, if that's the right word, by COVID. That this move from the sort of deregulated competitive policy framework that has driven public transport since, I guess, the 1980s, particularly in the US and the UK, but a number of other countries as well, into thinking about the detail of how you let contracts, how you have cost control, how you increase efficiency, how you bring the private sector in, how you reduce the element of the public sector in there, is all to some extent been thrown up in the air by the fact that the public sector has got to have been more involved in public transport across a wide range of issues. And that essentially is what I've selected from the wide range of papers that are in this first section, the policy context of the book. Now, there are papers that deal with, throughout the book, that deal with the details of how you actually manage a public transport system, how you define contracts and so on. But it seems to me we need to take a step back and think about how we genuinely put that public element, not necessarily public sector, but a public element back into public transport. And so that increasing interest is about transport and mobility justice, how transport can provide for all sections of society and not just those who are wealthy enough to be able to provide it either through their own transport, or as we've seen during the COVID pandemic, those people who can afford to have their own yachts and private aircraft drive around. No, it's got to be for everybody. And that justice, that accessibility for all is important, which puts back a real emphasis on understanding the drivers of transport demand. What are the things that actually cause people to want to move? And that includes values and social norms. So those are important as well in terms of understanding the way that people view public transport, in the way that they want to manage their own public transport demand in the context of their overall mobility. And with that, we need to think about the governance framework. How can you deliver an integrated public transport service that meets those mobility needs with an appropriate balance of public and private provision? So it seems to me that we're going back to thinking about those issues that Steve highlighted on his very first slide about the all being pervasiveness of public transport, or of transport as a public facility. And so what I've done here is brought together 4 contributions that reflect some of these changes that are going on, that I think tell the story very well. And the first 3 of those are, assuming the whole thing works, are based on videos that have been provided by the authors. So we're going to start with Wijnand Veneman, who's going to talk about public transport governance. What are the issues that need to be involved in that? Is it as simple as sometimes it is thought in the how do you define contracts argument, to something that is rather more complex than that? To look at mobility as a service, MaaS has become very much one of the buzzwords in terms of this. But how does it relate to public transport? And what Goan Smith is going to do is going to say something about the different approaches, particularly taken from the Nordic countries in Europe, which have different blends of private and public contributions to providing mobility as a service. And thirdly, Veronique van Acker is going to talk what she calls the soft side of the story, but this is essentially this idea of how you bring together values and norms to think about the issues that drive public transport demand. So it's not just a simple, if you like, mechanical economic story that goes with that, but it needs to build in other things as well. But finally, as a sop to at least one of the editors with this, I thought I ought to include one of his chapters in this. But Lucy, I think, is going to present the idea of public transport integration. And that also is something that is very, very live and kicking now, as many local authority areas and regions are thinking about how they can bring together a wide range of integration in public transport, including these new modes, the Ubers, the rental electric scooters, and so on like that, to provide that range of transport that is important in that. So that's the plan with this. And what I'm going to do now is to, I hope, bring up Wijnand's video.
Hi, thanks for getting the opportunity to introduce our chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Public Transport. I wrote the article that I'm going to introduce together with Fabio Ison, one of my postdocs, and we looked a bit at the whole field of public transport governance and how that has developed. Don't want to talk too much about the whole content of the chapter, because it's a nice chapter. I think reading it is a good idea, but I want to talk a bit about why I think it's important that a topic like that is part these days of a book like this. Basically, some time ago, in the, let's say, in the 1990s, what we saw was that there was this interest in the way in which the regulatory regime of public transport was set up, which is basically the way that on a mostly national level, the market for public transport has been developed. And we saw a big influx in that period from neoliberalist or liberalist thinking, focusing on the idea of competition in that market. The idea was that public transport lacked competition that was in line with a lot of stuff that we saw in the field of regulatory policies, especially in Europe, especially also on the level of the European Union. And this is where in that period, basically going on to the 1990s and going through that, there has been a lot of talk about how to improve the regulatory regime by introducing more competition in that space. Obviously, there's a few specific problems with that in terms of public transport. First of all, being infrastructure playing an important role, infrastructure having this natural monopolistic tendency, public transport, the value of public transport not necessarily being landing within the sector itself, so that there's a lot of public value that's outside the field of public transport. So every person that uses public transport is a car less often on the road. So this is where there's a few things that make that thinking a bit simplistic. But in various countries, and not only Europe but elsewhere, there was this rethinking done about what that regulatory regime of public transport would be, and this is where and how competition could be introduced. We saw that happening a lot in a form of tendering, where basically governments control quite a lot of public transport. So this was a starting point for a lot of researchers, including myself, where we looked at the wider perspective of governance. So it became clear to us when researching this field that the whole idea, this neoliberal idea of how competition would work, was far too simplistic, and that there's all these different mechanisms that drive the way in which decisions can be made in public transport, competition being one. So if passengers are making a decision for one or the other, that is a way in which the outcome of public transport is set up. And this is where we looked at how other mechanisms would exist and how that broader perspective could be developed. This is where basically Powell gives us a number of mechanisms that we see. Three big ones are that market mechanism. There is a hierarchical mechanism, and then there is a network or cooperative mechanism. So a lot of research that we looked at is how these different mechanisms work in the space of public transport. So think about it in a way that a transport authority and an operator, how are they working together in making sure that they deliver the best services that they can for a specific region. It also became clear that original perspective, that more neoliberal perspective, simplified the values that public transport has to deliver to society far too much. So yes, obviously, public transport is better when it has higher patronage, and yes, obviously, less subsidies are involved. It's also probably a good idea. Maybe when the speed is higher is also a good idea, but especially with the growing focus on transition, sustainability, all these other things, inclusiveness, it becomes clear that there's a far wider set of values that public transport is expected to deliver upon. And this is where the simplistic perspective of higher efficiency in public transport through competition has proven to be a far problematic way of looking at it, and how to deliver a regulatory regime, a contracting form, decision-making structure between an authority and operator that delivers for the passenger. That has become a field that has developed substantially over the last decades. So this is an area that seems to have established itself in this field, and this is where we're happy to contribute to that. And this is where we were happy that in these days, when you deliver a book, that is the Handbook on Public Transport, it is inclusive of these different perspectives, that we can help transport operators and authorities work on the way in which they organize the decision-making processes in those fields, and through that eventually deliver better services for the passenger. In new fields are the way in which you include, for example, clever modeling in the decision making. How do you fit it? Fields include how do you bring that perspective of the passenger to the decision making process, and this is where the chapter tries to give a few hints. Okay, thanks for listening in. I hope that if you catch the book, it helps you a bit in understanding how this new field is developing from a very simplistic regulatory regime perspective to a broader analysis of the way in which decision making is organized in public transport. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I think that does give a very, very useful identification of the way that governance often sounds rather boring, but governance isn't boring. Governance is actually terribly important in this. And I think those sort of key words that Devine put up actually show a good way into that. Now what I'm going to do is to introduce another video from Goran Smith, which is actually dealing with a specific issue of mobility as a service. So if I can get this one going.
Hi everyone, my name is Goran Smith. Today I will briefly introduce the chapter Mobility as a Service and Public Transport, which is featured in the Routledge Handbook of Public Transport, and which is based on my PhD thesis, Making Mobility as a Service. Mobility as a service is a term that was introduced in Finland back in 2014, and which then has been a hot potato within the transport sector worldwide, really. It describes services that through a joint digital channel, most commonly a smartphone app, enables users to plan, book, and pay for multiple types of mobility services. So the tool is integration, and the idea is to make it easier for people to find, compare, and use multiple mobility services that can complement each other, so that they can solve, if not all, most of their mobility needs through mobility services and active mobility modes. And the hope is then, of course, that this should contribute to less car ownership and less car use and more use of these services instead. However, if or to what extent mobility as a service, or MaaS for short, has that capacity and under what conditions and for what people, we do not really know that yet. And the main reason for why we do not know that yet is that MaaS has been more difficult to realize than we first imagined when starting to discuss the concept. And the main reason for that, in turn, is that MaaS requires the introduction of two new roles into the ecosystem of mobility services. Someone needs to assemble the data and the offerings from all the different mobility service providers that are to be included. I call that role MaaS integrator. And then someone needs to bundle that information into nice services and sell those services to users, and I call that role MaaS operator. And since the start of the MaaS discussion, it has been a huge debate on whether public or private actors or both should adopt these new roles. We can have a public control scenario if public actors adopt them. We can have a market-driven scenario if private actors adopt them, and we can have a public-private scenario if we have something in between. Interestingly, we can see that thus far, different countries and different regions have gone in different directions here. And for instance, as I discuss and showcase in this chapter, we can see that in Norway, they have had the development that, especially in Oslo, that is leaning towards a public control scenario. In Finland, and especially in Helsinki, we have a market-driven scenario. And in Sweden, even though it has changed over time, we currently have a national inquiry that recommends a public-private scenario. And this, of course, has different implications for public transport authorities, and I discussed them in the chapter. But overall, we do not know which way is better. So we do not know that yet, but there's also a problem with those scenarios, and that is that they only discuss the end phase of MOS. When MOS is being operated and used, they do not discuss what public actors can do and should do in the process leading up to that. So the earlier phases of innovation, when the concept is developed and when it's diffused to people. So to better enable discussions about that, I have developed a framework that describes different roles that public transport authorities can take, but also other types of public actors. And they differ depending on whether the public actor is mostly hands-on involved, meaning that they produce or take care of innovation activities themselves, or if they're mostly hands-off involved, meaning that they mostly try to create conducive conditions for others to take care of those innovation duties. And again, here I discuss how in the chapter how you can categorize the public transport authorities in Norway, Sweden, and Finland within this framework in the chapter. So if you're interested in that, and if you're interested in what conclusions I think we can draw already, even though we do not know the impact of MOS, please read the chapter or download my thesis. You can find the links here, or if you do not have time to read it, please write to me. You have my email address there. I'm happy to talk more about this with you. So thank you for attention, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Corinne. That was a very useful, I think, contribution to that in thinking about the diversity that is involved in MAS. And that's something that I think not all of the discussions really go to. The next contribution is from Veronique van Acker, and this is looking at the soft drivers of this. So I'll play Veronique's soft side of the story.
Welcome to this presentation of the soft side of public transport. My name is Veronique van Acker, and I work as a researcher at LISER, which is the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research. Today, I am going to discuss the book chapter that I wrote together with my co-authors Saskia Sandoval and Mario Coles from the University of Liège in Belgium. When we talk about public transport use, we often focus on factors such as price, travel time, or also objective characteristics of the public transport user, such as age and income. But in our book chapter, we explain that two additional aspects should be taken into account. First of all, public transport use is not a decision that stands on its own. It should be considered as a part of a wider set of decisions. Using public transport on a daily basis or not is linked to medium-term decisions related to owning a car and longer-term decisions about where to live. For example, if you like living in an urban location with good access to public transport. So you have a hierarchy of decisions that are interrelated with each other. Now, my co-author Saskia, she collected data from Brussels in Belgium. And based on her data, we found that this decision hierarchy looks very simple for train use. We found only a significant influence of the urban residential location on it. But then it looks much more complex when you try to explain the frequency of bus, tram, and metro use. There you see that all these decisions on the different timescales are related to each other. Now, the second thing that we wanted to highlight in our book chapter is the importance of attitudes and values, because these decisions, they don't fall out of the blue. They have some origins, and it starts with attitudes. And attitudes actually refer to how we think and feel about the object of our attitude. In this case, we collected data about what is your attitudes towards residential location where you live in, and your attitudes towards the modal choices that you have to make. So based on the data of Saskia, we found the influence of 3 travel attitudes on bus, tram, metro use and train use. And the effects are as expected. For example, people with a positive attitudes towards sustainability and transport, they are also more likely to use bus, tram, and metro frequently. Now, we also found various spatial attitudes with an impact on the decision to live in an urban location. And here again, the signs are as expected. For example, people who have a positive attitudes towards having access to mandatory activities such as jobs and shops, they are also more likely to live in this urban location. And for that, there will also be an indirect effect of these spatial attitudes on public transport use. Now, more interesting nowadays is also that these travel attitudes don't only have a direct impact on public transport use, but also indirectly, because of the process known of residential self-selection. Sometimes people search for a neighborhood, an urban neighborhood that matches their travel attitudes. And based on the data of Saskia, we found that only this travel attitude towards sustainability and transport has a positive impact on living in an urban location. We also found a reverse process. There are signs that people who live in an urban location, over time, they develop a positive attitude towards sustainability and transport, or they develop a positive attitude towards saving time in transport. And that also then results in an impact on public transport use. And it's difficult to say which one of these 2 is more important. We found signs that for our data in Brussels, the 2 processes were found equally important. Now, these attitudes, again, they come from somewhere, they have origins, and the origins are in values. And values are these long-term enduring beliefs about what you think is important in life. We found various values with a significant impact on travel attitudes, but also spatial attitudes. I'm only going to show you some of them in relationship to these travel attitudes. For example, people who value it's important to behave according to the social norms, so that's the value of conformity, they are less likely to develop this positive attitudes towards privacy and comfort. And because of this attitude having a negative impact on bus, tram, metro use, the combined effect of conformity on bus, tram, metro will be positive. So people who really want to behave according to social norms, they are also more likely to use buses, trams, and metros. And for train use, we found that there is an indirect positive impact of benevolence. Benevolence that refers to people who value it's important to behave in a good way towards who want to do good to others, and especially people with whom you have a frequent contact. So if you found this value very important in life, then you're also more likely to use trains. And a little bit surprising is people who value achievements, having personal success in your life as very important, they're also more likely to use trains because of the fact that they are less likely to develop this positive attitudes towards time savings. Now, what do you learn from these insights? It's that there's a huge heterogeneity explaining why people use public transport or not. It can be linked to decisions that you made on medium term about owning a car, yes or no, or where to live. And it's not so necessarily the age of these older people that explains why they use public transport, but maybe the fact that they made the decision of not owning a car for some reasons. And these values, they can be helpful to design all kinds of promotion campaigns. You can play with these values and integrate them in your promotion campaigns. And these are just 2 examples of how to integrate this value of achievement in some campaigns or the value of benevolence, for example. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you will enjoy reading our book chapter on the soft side of public transport.
Well, thank you, Veronique. I think that also provides a very, very good overview of some of the issues that are involved in that. And I think we can probably all relate to our own experiences in terms of that. Now, what I am going to do is, I hope, bring up the final one. There we are. Lucy, are you there?
I am, Roger. Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everyone from the United Kingdom. The chapter that my colleague and I he heard from at the beginning of the presentation today wrote is this notion of public transport integration. And at first reading, you might think this is a really straightforward term. Everybody knows what it means in the lexicon of everyday conversation. It's this notion of bringing disparate ideas and components together to form this coordinated, functional, and we hope unified whole to enable a system, a process to work very effectively and efficiently to the benefit of all its users. And if we look at the etymology of the term, it originates, we understand, from the Latin, this notion of making something whole. And the word first came into use in the English language in the early mid-17th century. And it was very much this notion about making something whole. And I think the thing that we took away from that is that this notion of integration is very much an active process and not a passive state. And I think we've heard that already coming through quite strongly from the three presentations we've just heard. So it's a process fundamentally of creation, of evolution in response to changing societal needs, changing technology, changing regulation, changing governance. So if you'd be so kind, please, Roger, just to put on the first animation, what we can see then in terms of the purpose of public transport integration. We saw it very much in terms of 8 key attributes. And the first of these is to create a system that is accessible. But as soon as we start to unpick that term, we realise it's inherently problematic. Accessible in what sense? Well, clearly accessible in terms of being available when and where someone wants to use the system. But we also need to think of it in terms of being accessible for those with additional needs or additional mobility requirements, such as the visually impaired, those with hidden disabilities, as well as those with physical needs. But we also need to think perhaps in terms of accessibility, in terms of the information. Not everyone is able to access information online, for example. So we need to think about these terms in quite interesting and creative ways. Then we come on to this notion of affordability, and clearly cost is very important. But again, when we're talking about public transport, who are these publics? Historically, of course, we've had different classes of public transport. We're very familiar with first or premium class as opposed to standard. Very often you're travelling in identical vehicles, albeit with different seating configuration and different levels of comfort. The third notion of reliability, we perhaps also need to add here resilience, particularly to our changing climate. And we've seen recently the impact that extreme weather events have had on public transport systems. So we need these systems to be reliable, the services turn up as timetabled, as scheduled, but also as well this notion of resilience. They can adapt to enable people to get where they need to be in the event of unforeseen disruption. But so too, do they need to be sustainable? And here again, the term we need to unpick. Sustainable, of course, in environmental terms, but also as well in commercial and financial ones. Particularly at the moment, the impact of COVID has had real impact on public transport providers. Ridership has gone down, and of course, this has had an impact on their revenue streams. The purpose of public transport integration as well is to create a system that's convenient. And here we're not just talking about convenient in spatial terms, are the services available where you want them, but there's also an important temporal attribute here. Are they providing a journey that is comparable to that which could be completed by alternative private modes, for example? Are the services comfortable? Clearly, this is an increasingly important characteristic. You're not going to want to sit on a vehicle that is actually going to be inherently uncomfortable. And this leads us on to the penultimate attribute, this notion of safety. Clearly, we want to board a vehicle where we are going to be safe, we are not going to be involved in an accident. But we also need to think about safety in terms of personal safety, whether that's waiting at a remote station or a remote bus stop, whether that's travelling at antisocial times of the day or night. So again, we need to unpick these terms and interrogate them in quite careful ways. And the final one, seamless journeys. None of us want an interchange penalty. None of us want to have to walk miles at a transit stop to actually go between different modes. But we also perhaps need to think about seamless in terms of the payment. Do we actually have multiple payment systems? Is there a single end user payment service available? If you could advance to the next animation, please, Roger. Thank you. As well as the purpose, our chapter sought to look at the practices involved in public transport integration. And again, we provided a number of vignettes of public transport integration regimes in various different parts of the world. But fundamentally, wherever you are, what you're seeking to do is to co-locate different modes of not only public, but also private transport, and not only dedicated, but also distributed interchanges. And what we've seen is over time, these dedicated interchanges have gone from being mere modes of transit, i.e. stations, to destinations or desti stations in their own right, replete with a whole range of retail and commercial offers and facilities to actually make them attractive places to meet, of course, to travel, but also increasingly as well to invest. If we could move to the third bullet point now, please. And in terms of the provision then, clearly we want to think about creating places that are attractive, convenient and safe. We want to facilitate these multimodal journeys. We want to create temporally efficient, but also cost-effective connections to a wide number of spatially dispersed destinations. But here is the inherent challenge. Very often the operators are inheriting legacy networks that were laid down many decades, if not centuries earlier. And certainly what we see, particularly in the UK, is you might have an awful lot of very dense services on radial routes, but if you actually want to go across city or intercity, those routes can actually be quite problematic. They can be quite time consuming, and in certain cases also quite expensive. If we move on again, please, Roger, to the penultimate point on our presentation today. Clearly, public transport integration is generally seen as being a good thing. It is promoted by politicians, by academics, by practitioners as being a way of achieving sustainable travel outcomes, reducing reliance on private vehicles, reducing reliance on fossil fuels, improving local air quality, improving as well health and well-being. But the final point, I think, is an important one and goes back to the point I made right at the beginning, that integration is a process, not a state. And certainly it remains, I would argue, an aspiration rather than a reality for many places. And I think that's one of the important contributions of a handbook such as this, in that it brings together diverse perspectives of practitioners, academics, experts from all the way around the world. And it really provides a forum, I think, and a platform from which we can learn, we can identify, we can debate best practice, and then propose solutions for what public transport perhaps could or indeed should look like. So I'll leave it there, Roger. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Lucy. I won't say much in conclusion, but I think we've seen there that there are a huge number of issues that are related. And the thing that goes through my mind in this is, how do we as researchers explain that in a way that can be turned into policy and practice by politicians? And also, how can it be related to all of the stakeholders that are involved in difficult decisions about transport in a sort of transparent way, so that everybody is arguing from a same set of principles? And it seems to me that at the moment that isn't the case, that politicians have their own particular agendas that they want to explore. Planners have their own pet projects that they want to promote. And that means that there is a tendency very often for a resistance from those people who have slightly different value systems. And I think that's the next stage that we need to get over in terms of this. But I think I've managed to bring that session in, like all good public transport services should be, almost right on time. So thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. I'll hand over now.
Thank you, Roger.
I think I'm next. So
I think you are, Maria. Nice to see you.
See ya. Hello, everybody. Good evening, or depending on where you are. My session deals specifically with part D of the book, and it consists of a nice collection of 8 chapters, actually, which is quite good in terms of looking at various aspects of delivery for public transport. And we have with us 2 presentations from two of the chapters, but then I will be going through giving you an overview of the other chapters within the section. So before I do that, I want to give the floor to the first speakers. They are recorded interventions because of time differences, even though everyone is here and we're ready to take questions should there be any need for clarification. So I would ask Fatemeh to run the first presentation by Corinne, Mulley and Barbara Yen on parking provision, parking demand and public transport accessibility. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm pleased today to be able to share with you the contents of the chapter on parking provision, parking demand and public transport accessibility that was written by Barbara Yen and myself. The outline here is about the chapter as a whole, which talks about the impact of parking on public transport accessibility and the interaction between parking and public transport, particularly in respect of the built environment, and how parking provision and parking demand can influence the way in which people behave. The motivation overall for that chapter was to see how this fitted into the broader travel demand management strategies in order to make cities and areas more sustainable, and in particular how you could look at making first and last mile parking needs interact with development of economic activity and public transport services. Most of this presentation is going to concentrate on the case study, and in fact one part of that case study, to show how parking need and parking supply interacted in the business environment of restaurants. In particular, to highlight how there was a difference in perceptions between what actually happened and what restaurateurs thought, and the role of public transport in this. And in the end, we'll finish up with some conclusions and future research. In a sense, the overall motivation for the study that forms the empirical part of this chapter was things like this type of newspaper article, which highlights parking as a particular issue for businesses. And it's an issue that we saw reiterated time and time again in different parts of economic activity. The case study context is Brisbane in Australia, and we surveyed 3 distinct restaurant strips or streets. The first of those was shown in the top left-hand side, the Caxton Street area, which is primarily a bar or fast food type environment. The second was that on the right-hand side at the top, which is fine dining in an area called Eagle Street in the CBD of Brisbane. And it's notable that this street is the only one of the 3 that had free public transport and free ferry access. And the third area is the one at the bottom in Boundary Street in the West End of Brisbane, where there was more family type dining. We undertook intercept surveys in each of these 3 areas, both asking visitors to the area and restaurateurs what they thought. The next slide talks about the way in which the restaurateurs perceived their business, and then we will go on to look at how consumers were analysed as a result of our data. We only have time for one slide on the restaurateurs' views, but it is in itself very interesting. We uncovered a significant perception gap between what restaurateurs believed and what appeared to be the case as a result of our survey data. So here there are two graphs, both that look quite similar. The top one relates to how the restaurateurs believed people arrived at their premises, what sort of mode they used, and the bottom one relates to the revenues brought by these customers. So if you look at the top graph, you can see that the restaurateurs believe the predominant arrival means was by car, when in fact, if you look at the blue stripes, you can see that arrivals by car, walking, bus and train are fairly equal in their incidence. A similar story comes from the revenues in the diagram below, where the restaurateurs with the orange stripe believe that most of their revenues come from people who arrive by car, when in fact it's active travellers walking that bring the most revenue, closely followed by car, bus and train arrivals. From this point on, we'll be looking at how the customer is analysed within this empirical study. We took a choice modelling approach with a simple model being chosen that meant that people would be choosing their method of travel before deciding which type of restaurant they would be going to. This is the first of the results slides, and it looks at, first of all, a few things to do with methods, but also the results in relation to trip characteristics. In terms of method, the reference mode was chosen as taxi because of its low market share at 6%. The trip characteristics were treated as generic variables, and you can see that customers prefer, not surprisingly, a mode of travel that costs less but is nice and fast. This slide talks about the results in relation to dining habit. If you think back to the case study description that I showed earlier on, I described the three restaurant strips as comprising fast food or bar type food in the first area, fine dining in the second, and more family type dining in the third. So there are three particular results which I want to highlight here. The first one is in relation to how much spend is made. This is the average expense variable, where public transport is the reference case. And you can see that the first three items here, average expense, car, active and taxi, are all positive. And this tells us that relative to public transport, customers of all the other modes of arrival spend more. The next element is the visiting frequency, active. And again, you can see here it's positive. So we're seeing that active transport customers are in fact the most frequent customers to restaurants. And finally, the bottom two, the family dining restaurants, these are more visited by car customers and less visited by public transport customers. This final slide of results looks at location issues and social demographics. In terms of location, you can see that Eagle Street, which is where the fine dining takes place, is most frequented by public transport travellers. And this is the most central of the three restaurant strips, and it's undoubtedly because of the free public transport service and the free ferry service to the centre of the Brisbane CBD. The second area is on social demographics, where you can see that family by car is positive, suggesting the probability of travelling by car is increased if you have a family with more dependents dining together. And the second element, age and active, suggests that as people get older, they're less likely to go to a restaurant using an active travel mode. In conclusion, the empirical work shows a significant perception difference between customers and restaurateurs, which is something that planners need to take into account when looking at devising parking supply areas, and make sure that they don't only seek the view of businesses, but also the users of the area. A cross-analysis of the business perceptions with the way in which customers have travelled shows that car travel is important, but that all modes are important, and that restaurateurs are not always good at knowing where their economic well-being comes from, as their perceptions about transport access doesn't align with the evidence. And the analysis of the consumer shows that more public transport supply can increase the share of higher spending public transport users, and that customers that arrive by walking, cycling and public transport do actually contribute more to the restaurant trade than the business owners and managers think. Thank you for listening to this very short resume of our chapter in this handbook.
Thank you, Corinne, for that presentation about your chapter. I would now move to the second presentation, which deals with a very interesting chapter, very close to my heart, Public Transport and Travel with Dogs, by Jennifer Kent, Corinne Mulley, Lara Gott, and Nick Stevens. But I asked Fatima to run the video as well for this one. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Jennifer Kent. I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia, and in Australia it's traditional to acknowledge the traditional elders of the lands on which we stand. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Aboriginal lands. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands, the Wongal people, and to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'll now just share my screen. So, the work I'm presenting today is part of a research agenda that has now spanned 6 years and 4 publications. It's all about the way that people travel with their dogs, with a particular emphasis on how we can make travel with dogs more sustainable by enabling them to use public transport with their minders. The research has been a really wonderful collaboration with Professor Corinne Mulley. Now, while the research is really all about dogs, we're actually just using travel with dogs as a case in point of a trip type that our research has shown is quite common, yet not well considered in transport research. We call these messy trips, and we believe that there are many similarly unpredictable, underexplored trips that are not well considered by sustainable transport researchers and providers, and that better consideration of these messy trips might result in a more user-friendly and ultimately more successful sustainable transport system. So as I said, there have been several publications from this work, and the book chapter is just one of them, which focused specifically on analysis of pets on public transport policies from around the world. In this work, we looked at policies governing the carriage of dogs for 130 different public transport services operating in 48 different cities in 24 countries. Mostly in Europe, the UK and Australia. Now, the policies displayed several aspects of diversity which were surprisingly sophisticated. They extended beyond simple prohibition of dogs on public transport. The most extreme limit beyond prohibition is the need to place the dog in an enclosed carrier. While this limit might not discourage the carriage of very small dogs, it does restrict the use of services for dogs that are larger. Less restrictive limits include those that constrain the dog to travelling in a certain part of a train or in one area of the bus. Limits were also temporal. For example, dogs prohibited from riding during peak hour. And many policies also placed financial limits on whether the dog could travel by ensuring that the dog required a ticket. Now, a 3-point dog friendliness scale was developed to capture these nuances, and this was applied to the policy governing each service, as can be seen in the top table just here. Almost 2/3 of the transport services allowed dogs to travel with very few restrictions, which is the level 3 prohibition. Only one of these services was in Australia, with the remaining located in UK or Europe. All but 3 of the services entirely prohibited dogs on public transport, and that did entirely prohibit dogs on public transport were in Australia. Of the 85 services permitting dogs on public transport, 57 enforced some kind of restriction while still allowing the dog to travel outside of a container. The most common limitation by far was the need to purchase a ticket for the dog. Now, we were really interested in why some cities maintained prohibitions, such as the cities in Australia, and others were more open. And in this chapter, we present an analysis of one aspect of the policy making and public transport environment. That's the impact of national culture. Now, researchers long recognised variations in transport practices exhibited from city to city are underpinned by variations in culture, the study of which is helpfully defined as mobility cultures. While culture is not necessarily defined as nationality or by nationality, nor is it uniform across nations, indices of national culture can provide interesting insights into the mobility culture of a city. To measure nuances in national culture for this study, we used the Hofstede indices of national culture. The concepts and the tools that are associated with this framework have been rarely applied to transport research, but we believe they provide useful avenues to understanding why some cities have different public transport policies and different public transport usage. Now, the Hofstede framework is based on an ongoing survey of the value systems of a matched sample from 50 countries. The results of the survey are subject to factor analysis, resulting in scores of 0 to 100 allocated to each nation across 6 cultural dimensions. They're all listed here, and I obviously don't have time to go through them all. But I'm going to run through 2 in a little bit more detail. The first is uncertainty avoidance. This dimension quantifies the way in which individuals feel comfortable or uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. High scores on this dimension suggest a culture intolerant of unorthodox ideas and ways of doing things and anxious to control the future. A low score indicates a culture that is more comfortable and happier with different ways of thinking and living. France scores a maximum of 100 on this dimension, indicating a culture that is not comfortable with ambiguity and appreciates laws and rules that are clear. Denmark, on the other hand, scores just 23, suggesting the Danes are a bit more comfortable with the lack of structure. Another one is long-term orientation. This dimension describes the way a culture reflects on the past rather than looks to the future as a way to define itself. Low scores on this dimension suggest a society that is rooted in the past with strong traditions and resistance to change. High scores, in contrast, suggest a pragmatic culture which seeks to prepare for the future in a more embracing way. Cultures with low scores on this dimension are not accustomed to the pursuit of results that take a long time to achieve. By sticking with what is known, they're habituated to the achievement of quick results and as such pursue the fast fix over investment in solutions that can take time. With a score of 83, Germany is highly positioned on this dimension, signifying a culture that is practical and able to adapt tradition to accommodate the current situation. Australia, conversely, scores just 21, suggesting Australians are less flexible when it comes to modifying habits and customs. Now, correlations between the Hofstede dimensions for the 24 countries in our sample and the dog friendliness scores that we allocated for each public transport service were examined using Spearman's correlation coefficient. This table here shows that cultural dimensions are indeed correlated with the nature of public transport policies governing the carriage of dogs, with 5 of the 6 dimensions having significantly strong correlations. In summary, what the data suggested is that countries currently welcome dogs on public transport are generally associated with higher scores on the power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation cultural dimensions. They have lower scores on the individualism and indulgence scales. The results suggest that countries where dogs are permitted to ride public transport are countries where hierarchies are accepted, restraint and a long-term view of things are respected, Uncertainty is avoided and people are cared for in groups rather than considered as individuals. The common thread emergence from this analysis, we thought, was a real sense of conservatism and safeguarding of both the status quo and the collective. In many ways, it describes a culture that is quite unadventurous. These are not countries that routinely throw caution to the wind in the pursuit of short-term gratification or an enshrined sense of the protection of the rights of the individual. These are characteristics that might at first seem to suggest a situation more readily associated with a public transport system that might prohibit rather than welcome dogs. To travel with a dog is a risky thing. It involves the prioritisation of the rights of one passenger over another. Yet countries that allow dogs on public transport are willing and able to accept this risk and prioritisation and the resultant opening up of the service to all, even though such acceptance and action is not necessarily congruent with their approaches to other issues. The finding has several implications. However, we really want to acknowledge that cultural dimensions provide the policy context rather than explain it. The findings do not suggest that dogs are permitted on public transport because countries are conservative. The fact that countries are conservative yet still allow dogs on public transport, however, provides an insight into the way national culture shapes the environment in which public transport policy is made. It is possible that dogs on public transport in countries where it is permitted is a common and everyday occurrence. It's an insignificant occasion and a triviality that need not be received with any fuss or undue ceremony. The public transport system just accommodates it, just like it accommodates the rest of everyday life. This suggests that for these countries, public transport is a very normalised way to travel and to accomplish the day-to-day tasks of modern life. In countries where dogs are prohibited, however, the system is less open and available and perhaps only suited to trips that are predictable, such as the journey to work. To sum up overall, while dogs on public transport is the example that is used here, there are a myriad of seemingly other inconsequential trips that make up modern life that need to be accommodated by public transport services if they are going to become a mainstream mode of travel for all. Trips with young children or the frail elderly, those to pick up bulky goods or those chained together using a bicycle are all examples of travel that for many simply construe daily life, yet require a public transport system that accommodates degrees of temporal and spatial flexibility. Exploring these less common trip generators and seeking to understand the context in which they are regulated can provide vital clues as to how public transport systems can become more useful. Thank you, and I'd like to now take your questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. I guess your presentation, well, you can have a look at the chat. The presentations trigger quite a lot of comments, particularly from a number of attendees. Carol Cockerman said dogs are priceless, they're priceless additions to people's lives, but how often do they relieve themselves indoors and so on? So raising the issues related to issues on public transport. And then a kind of response came from Corinne in terms of, yeah, but there are more people feeling sick on public transport, which is also not very nice. And that might be, I would think, more often than dogs relieving themselves. And then the issues of allergies were raised. So, and then Kenneth said, so Corinne, are you suggesting we ban humans from public transit? So yeah, it certainly has inspired a lot of comments, which is of course nice. And Corinne's introduced one of her dogs to the presentation here. So, and we've seen Jennifer's dog in the last presentation. I have two dachshunds as well sitting behind me, so they're carefully listening to everything I say, just in case. Okay, Jennifer, Corinne, do you want to add something more, or are there any questions?
Well, how often do they relieve themselves? Because with my dog, I don't want to keep him inside for too long, but I do take him into many businesses that don't sell food, and it's wonderful. but you know, I do worry about people who have allergies. I just don't know enough people, but yeah, I can't leave him in there for too long. And then of course, if he smells where somebody else has urinated, he's more likely to do it, I suspect. So I'd just be a little nervous for a long visit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Cara. And I think what we're talking about is not necessarily long trips, but we're talking about sort of the shorter, being able to hop on a light rail, for example, and take your dog to the dog park instead of having to drive there. And, you know, I think often we've done other analyses of some of the comments that come up when we talk about this work, and we've done analyses of some of the other reactions to, you know, to the proposal of having dogs on public transport. And that's what comes up a lot, is this idea of mess and smell, and that dog owners aren't responsible enough and so forth. And our response to that is to say, first of all, it doesn't happen very often in the countries where dogs are permitted. It's not as though their trains are roaming around the system full of dog wee and so forth. Dogs are able to control themselves in public, or well-behaved dogs are. Secondly, the ability to enforce having to buy a ticket for the dog actually means that you can somehow incorporate a system to recoup the costs associated with cleaning. And even though there may not be huge costs associated with cleaning, that reassures people to say, look, these people aren't just free riding with their dogs, they are actually paying for the system. And then the final point that I often make in this context is that it's gone from my mind now. It's only 6 a.m. here in Sydney, so it's a little bit early. Basically, we often sort of try to say that, yeah, that it's not necessarily going to be a common occurrence. No. What we often try to say is that incorporation of this policy in a city where it doesn't already exist would need to come with an educational campaign for dog owners on what is responsible dog ownership. And I think that it would need to be, you know, a full-scale policy implementation plan that addressed both sides of the story.
Yeah.
And just as an addition to that, although Jen has been talking about short urban trips, certainly I'm reminded now that I'm back in the UK that dogs go on long distance trips. I've had taken 2 dogs and 2 children on a trip from Newcastle down to London, and I can tell you it was much more aggro with the children than it was with the dogs.
Yes, and there's certainly also something related to how long the tradition has been there in relation to dogs as well. So you see dogs, I don't know, behaving far better in countries where they've had dogs going to restaurants, you know, sitting by the tables, on the chairs in restaurants, in some European countries. And you know, there's an element of exposure for dogs to behave in a certain manner. So I think I think context makes a big difference, and history as well. So if you're at the start of it, then of course you're going to encounter the problems, but in time it becomes normalized for both humans and dogs, in actual fact. Well,
I do think they should have little grassy areas. I remember being in Vienna and I thought it was just horrific. Everybody wanted their dog, but nobody wanted to provide grass. So there was poop everywhere on those sidewalks. And I just thought, ooh, what's going on here? Those were dogs who were educated, Jennifer. They've been around other dogs. They may not get into fights, but they are, you know, just having to poop on the concrete, which is, you know, not as bad as a homeless person pooping on the concrete, but it is something that, you know, I'd never seen. And I thought that was pretty awful for Vienna. So I'd love to see more grass for them.
Now, what's interesting though is Vienna is actually one of the cities that's really, really open to allowing dogs on public transport. Their policy is one of the most sophisticated, and they also have like a system to be able to certify that your dog is safe on public transport as well. So yeah, but I think the open space, but I think what you're raising, Cara, and what you're saying as well, Maria, is that the importance of this national culture thing. So Maria was saying that the policy might take a bit of time to implement and that people would have to become accustomed to it. And one of the dimensions of national cultures was this idea of resistance to change and not being able to have that long-term perspective. And in Australia, we actually score really low, really high on that. So we don't have a good, we're not very good at thinking long term. We're not very good at sort of thinking, okay, this might be a bit rough in the beginning, but we'll get through it and it's going to be better in the long term. And so that's why these Hofstede dimensions actually do raise some really interesting insights. I think for transport researchers, they could be very helpful in other aspects as well.
Good. Thank you very, very much. We're just 1 minute over. So I just want to give you some information about the rest of the chapters. There's one chapter which I've co-authored with Charles Musselwhite on public transport and later life, public transport use and later life, which encompasses some of the aspects of equity, but also different transport modes. We have the importance of service information by Nigel Hartburn, public transport and social inclusion by John and Janet Stanley. We have intermodal strategies for cycling and acceptability by Lake Sagaris, accessibility and design for all by Nick Tyler, and network planning and design by Gustav Nielsen. So I invite you to not only read the book and not, of course, only focus on this section, but you'll see that we have, and you've seen that we've have some interesting chapters there. So I'll pass on the floor to the next chair. Roberto, no, it's Matt Daus. Yeah. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome everybody. We're going to move over to modal settings. And I believe that we have our other speakers here. I thought I saw Simon. Just waiting. There's John too. So yep. We're all hours of the night at all places around the world to discuss this beautiful book that we have, and we're very excited about it. And I think I can I share my screen, Maria or Fatima?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, let me try to see if I can figure that out. Okay, there we go. See my screen?
Not yet.
No? Nothing?
No.
Okay. My apologies here. Share. Okay, here we go. Anything yet?
No, not yet.
Uh-oh. This is not good. I have a new computer. That's a bit of the problem here.
Are you able to see the screen that you want to?
Yeah, no, I do. I can see my screen. It says open system preferences.
Oh, okay. So you have to, yeah, settings then.
Open system preferences. Zoom would like to record this computer screen. Okay. And I don't know. And then a security and privacy wall comes up. I'm not really sure what to do here. It's a new computer.
If you want to send me the slides, yeah, maybe.
Kim, are you there? Kim?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, I'm having some difficulty trying to understand what I'm doing that's wrong here. When I click on screen
maybe you have a firewall and you can.
A firewall. How do I get rid of that? It says desktop 1, Microsoft PowerPoint unknown. Allow Zoom to share your screen. Open system. It says open system preferences or cancel. And I open system preferences.
I'll walk you.
Right, and now it says privacy, and it's got 4 bars at the top: general, file vault, firewall, and privacy. And on the left-hand side, it's got contacts, reminders, photos, camera.
Yeah,
Do you have the?
Sure. Is this a PC or?
I'm sorry.
Let me see if I have
Okay.
a PowerPoint. Maybe I can share it from my.
Do you have the latest PowerPoint? That should be a pretty easy way to do it. My apologies, everyone. This is what happens when you get a new computer. I have a fancy screen now. I could put things on it, but I can't access it. Okay. Kim,
I'm sending.
do you have the latest one that has the correct photos of everybody?
I believe so. I have the one from earlier today.
Mm-hmm. There was some edits made to slide 3. I'm sending it to you now.
Okay. Send it to my Gmail, please, and I'll open it up.
Okay, here it comes. Okay, it is on its way. Okay. You have it?
Okay, one sec. Yep. Can someone allow me to share my screen, please?
She already made you co-host, Kim, so you should be allowed to.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Fatima is the tech staff, as you guys could probably tell, because she's listed as host in case you need her.
I think I closed it, Kim. Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to the first slide. That's the old one. That's the wrong one. Oh, here it is. That's the right one. Okay. All right, let's go to the first slide.
Sure?
First slide, please.
This is the only
First slide.
This is the only slide I have that you just sent.
I'm sorry? There's a whole PowerPoint.
Okay.
You're looking at the wrong thing. Did you look at my email?
I didn't. Did you email it to me? Because I don't see it. One second.
Email takes a
don't have it
couple
in my
minutes, especially from Matthew's fancy new computer.
This is unfortunate. My apologies.
Yeah, it's not in my inboxes yet, Matt.
Okay. Well, I'm not really sure what to do at this point other than to let's just wing it. Okay, everybody. So I'll just talk through this. I'm sorry. Kim, did you say something?
It's populated. I have.
You got it?
Yeah, the PowerPoint just emailed. Yeah, it was a large file.
Okay.
Sharing now. Sorry, guys, for the delay.
All right. So I'm from Brooklyn, New York. So I'm going to let's do a slide share, please. Thank you. So I'm going to talk as fast as I possibly can so that my Australian and UK colleagues can't understand anything I say. We'll get through it. All right. So let's go to the next slide. Could we do a screen share, please? I mean, Kim, can we do a full screen, please? Okay, there we go. Next slide. Okay, so today we're going to not be looking at all the chapters in this particular section, but the topic is modal settings. And we're going to be covering a lot of different modes, but not all of them, unfortunately. After I talk about taxis, Simon is going to talk about rail, John about bus and flexible transport. As you know, John was a co-editor of the book, and he's got several chapters in this particular section. Next slide. So we also have many other chapters that are excellent, by the way, and I think are must-reads, but we couldn't get to everybody today. So we have informal paratransit, we have air passenger service, economic and social success with ferry services. So there's a lot, all the modes are covered and different angles are covered in terms of how you work with public transit, and also how you innovate. Next slide. Next slide, Kim. All right, so in terms of my background, could you go back, Kim, please? Yes. All right, so, Simon is an assistant professor in transport at the University of Southampton. He's going to be the speaker after me, and John Nelson is professor at the University of Sydney and also chair of transport studies in Aberdeen. I'm chair of transportation technology chair at the City University of New York at City College. I was the former longest serving taxi and limousine commissioner or minister, and that's how I started my background in transportation. I'm also president of the Regulators Association worldwide, and I'm a transportation lawyer. So I have a lot of different hats and a lot of different perspectives that I brought to my chapter. Next slide. So this chapter talks about the history of taxis, mostly in the US, but it does draw some comparisons to other jurisdictions around the world, in a general sense, how the systems work. The history, what went wrong with the disruption movement, and also what opportunities there are for the future. Next slide. So history has somewhat repeated itself in many different ways. If I had to sum up the regulation of taxis from the time of the Great Depression on in the US and in New York City, was we had basically a market failure. There was an oversupply of cabs during the Great Depression. There were riots on the street because there wasn't enough business for the cab drivers, and they basically just threw their permits away or their licenses to operate these taxi cabs. A local council member or legislator put the Haas Act in place and got a law passed, which basically for the first time capped the number of taxi cabs to protect those economically who held them. And that is ultimately led in some of the major cities in the US to what we know as the medallion system. A medallion is basically the tin that you can see right next to the Routledge book that goes on the front of a cab, which is a representation of the license to operate one of these limited taxi cabs. And the thing that gives it its value is that you can buy and sell it, the city can auction it, and also when it's on the open market, people can buy it and sell it, and it's limited in its supply. So as customer demand goes up, as ridership goes up over time, these assets have appreciated in value until recently. So New York City was the first really to do it, and then Boston, Miami, Chicago, San Francisco, and Philadelphia are all medallion cities. In those cities in the US that don't have medallions, there are mostly systems where there's still a cap on the supply of the vehicles. There's a different process. Some cities have a process where you can petition the government as a cab fleet to add more, and you have to prove certain things before the regulator, minimal impact on the environment, that you have a need for the service. Every regulator has a different approach to doing these things, but in most cities, taxis are regulated locally, not nationally, and we have these systems of control of the supply. Los Angeles is the only city that had a franchise, along with Salt Lake City. Utah, where the government actually breaks up the geography and actually enters into a contract with the taxi companies, that is not the norm. In the US, it's either a permit system or a medallion system. Next slide. So the chapter then talks about disruption and the entry of Uber and Lyft into the market, in the early 2010s. And they came in initially on the taxi side and decided that that wasn't going to work for them because of all the regulations, and then went into the other side of the market, which is what we call for-hire vehicles or limousines. For many, many years, and still to this date, there's no market cap on the number of vehicles, with the exception of New York City now, which recently passed a law. So you, in effect, what you could do is get a business license to operate a limo company, and you could put as many vehicles on the road as long as they meet the insurance and the other regulatory requirements. But there was no limit on it. It was based upon what your business growth plans were, and it was a supply and demand type of thing that was done by the private businesses. So as taxi ridership started to plummet as a result of Uber and Lyft getting these types of licenses and then creating new laws that were for themselves with unlimited numbers of vehicles. It completely decimated the values of the taxi cabs. Every country and city around the world did not have the same experience, but most of the US cities, there's not much left of the taxi cab industry anymore. Not only did medallion prices drop, but those cities that don't have medallions, they're basically worthless, some of the cities. I did some work for the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and when we surveyed in the last couple of years the impact of Uber and Lyft operating almost like taxi cabs without a taxi license, basically, with their own special license, they basically have been relegated to airport work and wheelchair accessible work. And they're not doing anything else beyond that at this point. And there's not much left of the industry. Most of the hails that you have when people put their hand up don't exist. In Canada and Europe and Asia, there are different approaches. We touch on that in the chapter. Canada did a little bit of what the US did, but was late to the game. And Europe actually went in a completely different direction and actually refused to create special rules for Uber and Lyft or for Uber. And they have been more cooperative or forced to work with the regulators more. Next slide, please. So things got worse since COVID happened. We updated the chapter to discuss this. Obviously, with the shutdowns and the lockdowns in the US, rides continue to plummet in most of these cities, as you can see, and we basically have hit rock bottom at this point. There's never been a lower amount of business ever in the history of the taxi industry than we have right now. Next slide. What is really interesting is that during the pandemic, taxis started getting involved in different new business models, including food and package deliveries, and in some instances, actually doing government work, where government vehicles would usually be paid to take meals to seniors with social service programs. Taxis were put into action in New York and DC and Los Angeles and a bunch of other cities around the US to keep them busy during the pandemic. So whether that stays or goes as business starts to come back remains to be seen, and the future of the taxi industry is uncertain. Next slide. The TNCs provide quick and efficient customer service. You use the smartphone app to get where you need to go. They have subsidized rides and driver pay for many, many years. Now that Uber and Lyft have gone public as a public company, they are really, their feet is being held to the fire on a number of different levels. They've had labor issues. They've had social responsibility issues. They've been unable to meet wheelchair accessibility and equity requirements, though underserved communities in the pandemic in New York City have actually received more service as of late with the TNCs. The astronomical growth and the lack of regulations that would limit them until recently, which they've done in New York City, have basically been some of the issues that have caused concerns among transportation regulators, and they're covered in the book. And these are the 4 or 5 topics that we cover to talk about the downside of the disruption movement. Yes, it provides more efficient service to people. It's more fancy in many instances than a taxi cab. It comes more quickly. In some instances, it was cheaper, but at what cost? Next slide. So the book kind of covers all those topics and then kind of sets the stage at the end of the chapter for where we go from here in the future. And, John and Simon and I were talking about how we all want to suggest some future research opportunities for this conference for people who are listening. And I think when it comes to taxis, they do have a future. They need to be rebranded. The marketing needs to be better. They should get involved in some of these things that are on my last 2 slides. And researchers could have really contribute to how taxis can survive and stay alive by looking and studying some of these things. Wheelchair accessible vehicle service. Taxis are the only vehicles that have wheelchair ramps in the US, and that was a result of Uber and Lyft not wanting to get involved in that space. So now they have the vehicle infrastructure, and there's a non-emergency medical transport field and a public paratransit field, which is incredibly inefficient. The average trip with subsidies for taking a public transit ride in New York City, for instance, is $60 per 1.5 passengers in a multi-passenger vehicle. When you use a taxi, it's about $12 to $15 or significantly less. And the TLC had worked with the MTA in New York to save over $10 million a year by using point-to-point transport with accessible taxis through a brokerage arrangement, which is something which can and should be done around the country to make the paratransit system more efficient. Subsidized government transport. Lyft and Uber won a $50 million RFP to transport federal government employees instead of federal government employees buying vehicles on behalf of the government and using them to get around, non-emergency personnel. The taxi industry could look into doing that at the state and local level. Why not get rid of all the vehicles that the government is using? And if you need to take a business trip from one point to another or go to meetings, maybe there could be government contracts with the taxi industry. Same for corporate employee transport. They have credit cards now in the taxi cabs. They have apps. It's much cheaper than black car and limo services. Post-pandemic, companies are looking at shuttles and other safer ways to transport people other than public transit. Multimodal integration, something that we've heard a lot about so far, and it's covered in the book extensively. Mobility as a service and first and last mile partnerships. There's many of these partnerships in the US as part of pilot experiments with the federal government funding in mostly small public transit cities. However, mostly Uber and Lyft have taken advantage of those first and last mile integrations where you get off the bus, you get off the subway, and you have no place to go. So why not jump into an Uber or a Lyft? But why not a taxi? Equity and service to underserved and low-income communities should be studied because the rates of fare are controlled in the taxi industry by law, and they're much lower than Uber and Lyft. And my last slide details other opportunities for further research. Kim? Autonomous vehicles, they should be embraced. This is something I think could be a game changer for the taxi industry, especially since they hold the permits, and those permits in many cities need to be bought back legally. So the governments are stuck paying the bill for those permits under any circumstances. So why not partner with some of these connected and autonomous vehicle companies? We do need to have one app. I think that will lead the way to mobility as a service. The problem that the industry has faced is they've not been able to get their act together and get one app that the government can use or that the private sector can use to hail all the taxi cabs. That would be a solution to competing with Uber and Lyft. And also electrification and infrastructure is big. In New York and a bunch of different places around the country, taxis are experimenting with this, and it's a big issue in the US being pushed at all levels in terms of funding. And it is the future, the EVs, but there's not enough of them happening. And food and package delivery probably should be a permanent part of what we do. And the future is uncertain at this point, but these are some ideas for research to help keep this industry alive. Next slide. Kim, next slide, please. Well, okay, that's it. All right, well, that's all I have. I'd like to now turn it over to Simon, who's going to talk about his chapter. You have a screen share?
Yeah, I've got a screen share, which I will hopefully make work. Can you see that okay?
We see it.
Great. Okay. So good evening, everyone. My name is Simon Blaney. I work at the Transportation Research Group of the University of Southampton in the UK. And I'm going to just talk very quickly about some of the points we discuss in the chapter on urban, suburban and regional rail, authored by myself and my colleague, Professor John Preston. So in the chapter, we start off by thinking about the different types of rail system which are out there in and around our towns and cities. So ranging from sort of the standard mixed traffic heavy rail, which goes back to the earliest days of the railways, but also more specialist types of railways, so heavy rapid transit, things like the London Underground or the New York Subway, heavy suburban rail systems, like, for example, the German S-Bahns, and then light rail and tramway systems, like this one you can see, I think, in Bordeaux, probably in France. We then look in more detail at some case studies of particularly successful rail systems in cities. So, for example, the Hong Kong MTR, particularly focusing on the high levels of reliability and also profitability achieved there, with the latter being linked to the very successful rail and property development program. Also, the Paris RER, so the regional rail system there, and particularly how it pioneered the idea of linking separated suburban lines using cross-city tunnels. Also, the tram train network in and around Karlsruhe, so linking conventional suburban railway networks with city centre light rail systems to essentially give better accessibility to the city centre. Also, the system in Zurich in Switzerland, particularly looking at the TACFAR plan, and so the coordinated timetable which operates in Switzerland, covering both rail but also other public transport modes, and that really is an exemplar, I think, of how to get integration right. And then finally, the Docklands Light Railway in London, and particularly the contribution that's made to urban regeneration and transforming the former Docklands into a second CBD for London. So a number of different case studies showing how rail can be really successful in different ways in providing effective public transport to cities. But what I want to focus on really this evening is looking at some of the future research challenges identified in the chapter. And there's a number of things that I could mention here, and I haven't got time to do anything more than skip over them. But first of all, the challenge of crowding, because demand growth has, at least pre-COVID, placed a lot of pressure on many urban rail systems, particularly at peak periods. And there's been a lot of work looking at how this excess demand can be managed to try and maximise system efficiency. Now, one solution to improve efficiency could be increased automation, but actually automation can be very expensive and can create quite a lot of new problems. So I think there is work needed looking at where automation can deliver value for money and where it will deliver benefits, but also where it may cause as many problems as it solves. And one of the problems that can be linked to automation is excuse me, the challenge of integrating different systems, because as our use of digital technologies becomes more complex and pervasive in the rail context, there have been increasing challenges around keeping systems operating efficiently and getting the different systems to work with one another. And this has caused some quite big delays and cost overruns for many projects, notably the current Crossrail project in London. So there is a research challenge around trying to make system integration work better. There's also a more general issue around costs and cost escalation. Constructing, extending and enhancing rail systems has always been relatively expensive, but there has been a lot of project cost inflation in recent decades. And I think for rail to be able to fulfill its potential in contributing to a sustainable transport system, we do need to find ways to drive down these costs. Otherwise, rail will simply be unaffordable in many contexts, particularly in more developing countries. And it's not just about controlling costs, it's also about finding ways to help railways to actually make a profit, both by reducing operational costs, but also by exploiting additional sources of revenue. And I think the case study of Hong Kong, but also some of the Japanese private railways can really offer some potential exemplars here of how to do better at diversifying revenue sources and therefore enable trains to make a profit. Integration with other modes. Well, there's quite a lot of hype at the moment around mobility as a service. This has been mentioned already in this session. I would argue perhaps it's actually less of a step change than it's sometimes portrayed as, but there is undoubtedly potential to improve rail's integration with other modes in many contexts and to help rail become more attractive as part of an integrated public transport service offer. And then finally, and most importantly, in terms of improving performance, rail can be a very low carbon mode if it's done right, and it can outperform pretty much all of its mechanized competitors in terms of carbon using proven and existing technology. So I think there is a very important research challenge in terms of finding ways to enable rail to really maximize its contribution to carbon reduction. But then since we started working on the chapter, actually there has been quite a step change in the environment for rail as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID has had a huge impact on travel patterns, and I think the impact on rail has been particularly challenging because there have been big reductions in work travel to city centres and in medium distance business travel in many contexts, which arguably pre-pandemic were really rail's key markets. So I think there is a need for research to help the industry respond in two main areas. So first of all, looking at changing travel patterns and the extent to which the changes in demand patterns stimulated by COVID will persist into the future. So will commuting and business travel return? Will there be growth in longer distance irregular commuting? And if there are long-term reductions in peak travel to cities, well, what are the implications of these for rail? How do they change the infrastructure and service requirements? Does the peak capacity challenge disappear? And is there then a need to revise the way in which we plan our services and utilise our infrastructure in order to meet changed travel needs? So what kind of new markets can rail exploit to increase its usage, to increase its mode share? And can it work harder at attracting the discretionary leisure market? And then alongside that, there's also a need for research to look at changing user expectations, so ways in which rail can be made more appealing to discretionary travellers, so places where people have more of a choice of mode. And there may perhaps then be a need to reconfigure and redesign trains and services to provide more of a focus on comfort and convenience and value for money. And then finally, as COVID remains a concern for people, we also need to undertake research, and I know there's quite a lot going on in this area, to look into ways in which rail can be made to feel a COVID-safe environment. So making rail safe, but also allowing people to perceive that travelling by rail is still safe, even in a world where COVID remains a concern. So I will finish there because time is limited, but I do think this is really quite an exciting research area going forward. There's a lot to be done, and it's a really important area in terms of getting public transport right. So thank you for listening, and I will attempt to stop sharing my slide.
Thank you, Simon. All right, so John, you're up next. John Nelson from Sydney, who's going to talk about buses and flexible transport.
Thank you very much, Matt, and hello to everyone. And could somebody just confirm that you can see my screen? Thank you. Okay, and apologies to Roberto as we're now into time allocated to your session. So I will go briskly. I'm talking about two chapters, buses and flexible transport, starting with the chapter on bus, from workhorse to thoroughbred, and there's a little bit of a clue there in the title as to the way in which we set out our stall, if you like. We're very keen to have as a starting point the fact that we really believe, I want to emphasise, buses form an integral part of the urban fabric of cities. We rehearse some of the reasons for that. They're able to provide connectivity and access into distributed suburban areas. Unlike many of the rail-based solutions, they're very good at connecting people, employment, and services. We do take, at the outset, an historical perspective as we look at how buses have evolved over recent decades, and chart the trend really of moving from emergence, enthusiasm, if you like, high patronage, to a period of decline, and then more recently a period of resurgence. In taking this historical perspective, we provide a detailed look at what has happened in the UK, mainly because its approach has been well documented, but of course it's also been an interesting laboratory in terms of the approach towards deregulation and privatization. We have quite a strong focus on technology and the way in which technology has been an enabler for enhancing the service offering. Not just nowadays, one mentions technology and inevitably people think about apps and various real-time applications, but we're looking at technology from a whole systems perspective, and we have a focus on what we call next generation bus, looking at route treatments in the form of buses as a high level of service. The term that has emerged, if you like, is the European response to BRT and to bus rapid transit itself. We have a strong focus in the last part of the chapter on BRT in developing countries, using Latin America as a case study where some really impressive carrying capacity figures are realized. And then looking at how BRT has emerged, we highlight the importance of decision making and the role of institutional structures and also different approaches to service design. As with the other chapters, we have some suggestions for further future research. In the case of the bus, this cannot be separated from the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the quite catastrophic impact on patronage worldwide. And this provides an interesting conundrum, really, whereas in the past and right up until pre-COVID, future research might have been sketched in terms of, for example, let's look at ways of increasing the popularity with the public, travelling public, enhancing the existing service offer. In many cases now, it's very much concentrated on finding ways for public transport to actually survive, to be there as we emerge from the impact of the pandemic and adjust to ways in which we live with COVID-19. So this is a very, very serious and urgent time for public transport more generally, especially in the face of often negative messaging, which has been telling us don't use public transport, it is unsafe. But if public transport is to be the backbone and continue to be the backbone of mobility in cities and beyond, we need to find ways of ensuring its survival, and we tackle some of that in our concluding remarks. The second topic is the chapter on flexible transport services, which obviously also has a very strong public transport theme. We like to use the term flexible transport service because whilst we're essentially looking at flexibly routed public transport services, we bring in other forms of collective and shared transport, including taxis that Matt was talking about previously, community transport, and indeed other forms of publicly funded collective transport services. We talk about the operating context for flexible transport service, looking at the historical emergence of restricted or special transport services, and indeed the role of technology in enabling flexible transport to become services that are open to all. We have a strong focus on approaches to the design and evaluation of flexible transport services. There's still so much that needs to be learned here and communicated. The economic framework is essential. Understanding the costs involved in the design and implementation of flexible transport services and the responsibilities associated with that, the different ways of designing flexible transport services, and there's just a few little examples there on the chart. Area-based feeder services focused on trip attractors such as hospitals, retail centres, and business parks. And perhaps one of the key factors, and we actually identify this as an area for further research as well, is the need to invest time on understanding the best way of raising awareness about flexible transport services to the public at large. They are, in effect, often quite invisible when compared with fixed route, fixed scheduled services. And finally, the last portion of the chapter looks at the case for rural flexible transport services, still an under-researched and undervalued component of the rural mobility key. And we identify there the importance of working with the appropriate stakeholders. My last slide on future research, lots of open questions and exciting areas to explore as both Matt and Simon identified in their presentations. Here in New South Wales, for example, there's a great desire to understand more about how we can design a network which truly integrates flexible transport services and fixed route services. And yes, we'll be looking at the role of autonomous vehicles in the future. A little more basic, we still need to know more about how to achieve fair integration between flexible and fixed route to give the travelling public the most seamless experience. And I mentioned already the need to devote more attention to raising awareness just about what exactly this product is that we're offering and how it works. In an urban context, we're seeing more and more appearance of micro transit services. How should they best be implemented? How also should they integrate with the wider public transport offer? Simon mentioned MAS. We fully expect flexible transport services to be an integral part of the MAS offer. But how, again, do we position them within the MAS offer? And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic is as relevant here as to the other contributions that you've heard so far. Open questions: what effect will COVID have on market demands and operator supply for these types of service? And again, with taxi, obviously there have been issues around sharing the use of a vehicle within a confined space. Ultimately, another open question was, will this lead to more or less interest and need for flexible transport solutions? Well, time will tell. Finally, just to acknowledge the authorship of these two chapters and the contact details of the co-authors as well. And at that point, Matt, I will stop as yes. I think time is up.
Yes, I don't think we have time for questions. I think Roberto is up next.
I think so. Hello, everyone.
Yes. Apologies for the technical delays that caused
that's okay. That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Certainly, good evening for me and for my colleagues in the UK and Europe. So it looks like I'm between you and your break. Well, this break was a bit of afternoon coffee or maybe an evening. So I'll try to be brief. So I'm chairing or of leading this session and also the sole speaker. So I think it's going to be relatively easy to keep time in that sense. So without further ado, I'll just share my screen and we get on with it. Right. Okay, let me just get rid of that as well. Right. So so I'm going to do a bit of an overview of this part of the book, which is has the exciting title of The Future. My name again, Roberto Palacin. I'm from Newcastle University. I actually author one of these chapters. When I talk about the future, whatever the audience is, I always kind of include some sort of disclaimer because predicting the future is a risky business, and of course we have methods and methodologies to do that, but I always feel that you have to be very, you have to treat it with caution, and it is particularly relevant when we talk about the future of transport when we have the COVID disruption, as we've been discussing by various colleagues already. So there, my disclaimer in terms of talking about the future. This is basically just the overview of what I will talk. So when I was thinking about how to best present this part of the book, I kind of thought about a sort of almost impossible type of Venn diagram where you can see that the 4 titles or the 4 chapters where everything is is really intertwined and interrelated. So although each one of these chapters has its own self-contained independent narrative, and they're all very good reads, and I recommend you to have a look at them. You can just see by the titles that they're all kind of related to each other. So credit again to our fantastic editors, John, Corinne, and Stephen for kind of weaving in all these different themes. So if for example, you look at the theme of chapter 40, talking about automated vehicles, that's clearly a component of technology, which is in 41, but also the governance of automated vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and the issues with safety, security, for instance. And finally, that kind of encapsulates what it could potentially be the future of mobility. That's just one example, okay? So four chapters, all very closely related to each other, but independently described. So putting things in periods in culture is actually not talking about the future, but we have 4 futures. These 4 futures, as you can see there, in chapter 43, talks about discusses these kind of areas where the idea is not try to predict those futures, but try to see what kind of planning and what kind of efforts we can have in terms of shaping these futures. And I think they are kind of a logical chain of futures. So you can see the holistic integration of them. So the future of public transport inevitably shapes and influences the future of mobility, within terms is kind of always referred to as the lifeblood of society, and by default sort of the future of the planet. So there's kind of a narrative and a discussion about these kind of issues, but also the big kind of constant disclaimer, if you would, of the high levels of uncertainty that this brings. And again, in this chapter, like in pretty much all of the chapters, there's also a consideration of the impact of COVID. And in particularly when we're talking about these 4 futures, there's a reflection about the likelihood that the recovery of public transport from the effects of the pandemic is gonna take much longer than the actual pandemic being kind of integrated in our everyday lives. I think, perhaps, I don't know if it's a good signal or not, but perhaps, public transport is likely to get long COVID, in the sense of, take a very much longer recovery time. So that calls for a need to research to understand these 4 futures in a more integrated and systems approach, apply a systems approach to it, have a more holistic approach to them, which in turn calls for a creative thinking about how we plan and shape for these type of scenarios. There's also inevitably, when we look at the future of these 4 futures, there is an element of governance, and governance is also a theme that appears in other parts of the book. In fact, the first 2 chapters of the book are dedicated to policy and regulation and governance, which is linking there. This particular part, because we're looking at the future, the author Kate looks at discusses the term smart mobility, and the kind of very loose meaning that different people have different understanding of what smart mobility is, and perhaps it has a more of a marketing ring to it, as opposed to a very sort of thorough kind of term. But nevertheless, there's the discussion about what smart mobility entails and what sort of governance associated with that could look like. So there is a discussion about the type of challenges that smart mobility will face, and the role of governance in shaping the public transport future. So again, linking between those 4 futures. And the call for research here is to perhaps use some of the efforts in terms of looking at those design aspects of transport, and look at the governance of those efforts. And there's an area which I find particularly relevant and interesting, and very kind of aligned with some of my own work and thinking, which is this technology optimism that we have in recent times, particularly with smart mobility, could potentially be a distraction, and instead we could use that to be a force to restore trust in public transport. And I think this is something very important in the sense that it's relatively easy to lose the trust in public transport, and we've seen what's happened with the threat of COVID, for instance, but there are plenty of other examples, and it's incredibly difficult to regain the trust. And without that trust, again, looking at COVID, we can see a rise in private car rides, for instance. So without that trust in public transport, it will be very difficult to enable the kind of futures that we discuss in this section of mobility and so on. So from a clear example of that is mass and the backbone, as John was recently talking a few minutes ago, of public transport being the backbone of mass. So that kind of discussion is covered in the governance part of it. But of course, we cannot talk about the future without talking about technology, and technology features in at least two of the chapters. Kara's, I don't know if Kara was in the call earlier on, I don't know if she's still around there, but Kara's chapter and my own. So this is just a non-exclusive sort of timeline of key events of technology over the years, the past 50 years, that have shaped transport. Again, John was talking about BRT, so BRT in South America in particular, in the early 70s, developments in Curitiba and also in Canada, and then the first driverless trains in Japan in the early 80s, to changes in bus design to allow better accessibility, to smart ticketing, and the new modern BRT, or even the new bus services that John was talking about in recent years, and of course technologies related to signaling of trains, for instance, and of course maps. So this is just a bit of an overview, and the chapter just sort of kind of ponders about these pioneering cities and how these technologies have now shaped how public transport is, and what new technologies could be, or what new applications of existing technologies could actually take us to the future. But also the chapter discusses that particularly in today's world, technology and digitalization is very strong. It's permeating across all levels of society, and there is also a very clear link with the decarbonization efforts that we have in society, and indeed the net zero targets, and particularly for transport, and public transport, of course, is no different in that sense. So excuse me, it links back to kind of the context of the four futures, particularly the future of the planet, but also and looks into those kind of technologies as well, not just the obvious one. Chapter 40 is specifically dedicated to autonomous vehicles and vehicles of the future, and autonomous buses in particularly are discussed. And this picture is also in that chapter. It's the recent launch of a trial with some fully autonomous buses in Singapore, and actually we're taking the liberty, and I hope this will work, to just a very brief 1-minute video which covers all the technology that is loaded in these vehicles, which is actually described in chapter 41 as well. So it kind of links the two chapters rather nicely, I think. And I'm going to try to stop the music there. Yeah, excellent. So of course it's fully electric. So looking at propulsion systems in there, it's fully equipped with all the latest technology in terms of cameras, GPS, and so on. The software is and the equipment for comfort of for ride comfort, and is all in the latest technology in terms of maintaining those levels. Cybersecurity is hugely important, so levels of cybersecurity there. The charging and different type of technologies, which are also discussed in other chapters in terms of opportunistic charging strategies. The ability to identify pedestrians and other micromobility users in the network, and of course the the reduction, the significant reduction in emissions, because again links to the planet and the future of the planet and the whole efficiency of the system. So as you can see that in one single vehicle is kind of covering a lot of the technologies that are discussed not only in chapter 40 but also in chapter 41. And I'm just going to try to get away from here. Yes. So I know you're all familiar with this, so I will not dwell too much on it. But of course, autonomous vehicles. There are 6 levels of autonomy. If we consider level not, with no automation whatsoever. And today, pretty much every new vehicle on the road, whether it's public or private transport, is at level 2, has some level of automation, whether it is park assist or lane departure monitoring or a number of other technologies. So current and to the future, looking at the future, is level 3 to 5. Level 3 is already integrated in some vehicles. I can think of, for example, autopilot in Tesla, but not necessarily in public transport, at least on road transport. This is just for road transport, I must stress. But in level 3, you still will need a human to be ready to take over the system in particular circumstances. So the interior will be very similar of current interiors with the steering wheel and so on. But levels 4 and 5, you're not going to need necessarily, particularly in level 5, you don't need anyone. It could be completely, it's no need a steering wheel or anything like that. Of course, this technology is not necessarily new. So the railways have been doing it for 40 years now. And the railway talks about grades of automation rather than levels of autonomy, but basically it's the same principle. And this kind of diagram, chapter 40, describes those 4 levels. And there is a discussion about the transfer of knowledge between what the railway has been doing, with all the caveats, of course, on what a railway is and a bus system is, and then the kind of integration with the surroundings. Of course, there are many differences, but the one thing that perhaps I think is very relevant is not necessarily the technology deployment per se, but the perceptions of security. So for example, in grade of automation 3, you still have a train guard on the system. You probably don't need it. In fact, you don't need it. You could operate things completely driverless with automatic, with no one on board, like in Lille or Turin or perhaps in Vancouver. But nevertheless, operators might choose to have a train guard. So there is that kind of trust. So going back to the governance, going back to the accessibility, going back to health and safety. So there's some sort of synergies in there that perhaps there is a lesson to be, some transfer of knowledge in there. Not want to dwell too much on this, but the chapter 40 also looks at particularly 3 main areas of concern about the driverless public transport services. So safety and security, of course, not just in terms of the users, the public, but also in terms of things like cybersecurity. You know, if public transport is fully automated, how secure is that, and how vulnerable is to external potential malicious attacks. Also ponders about the practical characteristics in terms of space, but also time and speed. And finally, also discusses the value of travel time. So you don't have to be a part of involved at all in the driving activities, and what can you do with that time, and what are the effects and the benefits of that. All the technologies that are discussed, of course, are propulsion. I mentioned the electrification of transport, but also fuel cells and perhaps other technologies, and how. And so that's also discussed, and some examples of deployment of trials and pilots across the world are also discussed in there, and specific technologies, and also things like infrastructure. So strategies for charging. In that video, you can see that there was a charging with a pantograph effectively, and charging on stops to have continuous charging as the buses go along. But there's also low power strategies where you just plug at night in the depot and have full capacity for the whole duration of the service day. Other technologies described are variable signage for smart cycling. Those pictures are from Copenhagen. That variable signage system was implemented 4 years ago, because believe it or not, in Copenhagen, there are cycling traffic jams, so and traffic congestion. So this kind of helps smoothing out the traffic peak hours in Copenhagen, which is a very nice problem to have, I think. And some of the technologies are also discussed in this chapter. So just finishing now, I appreciate that the writing there is impossibly small, and I do not expect you to read it. That's why you have a copy of the book, or you should have a copy of the book, and you can have a quick look. But this is a way of kind of finishing with a bit of a vision of what the future integrated mobility from a technology perspective in particular could look like. And I think whatever the features that we look at, clearly, particularly for large metropolitan areas, a robust and efficient mass transit system is essential to be able to deliver the mobility that we want to have, the levels of mobility we want to have, and also respecting those of core features in terms of the future society and the planet. So in many cities that might be existing rail-based systems, but in other parts of the world, I think there's been very good examples across the different chapters in the book. BRT and alternative systems will deliver that. Whichever the system is, I can see that. So the bottom half there is for the end user will see the user technology. So the system will be personalized. It will recognize me. I will walk through the transport nodes. I will know exactly where I go. The system will guide me through it. There will be no timetable. It will be fully flexible, fully ready for me. I will know exactly my next stage on the travel. My trip will be ready for me, whether it's a autonomous pod, or is a e-scooter or bike or whatever it is, will be ready for me, and I will be guided from that perspective. From the system, that technology will allow, for instance, in terms of railway, for instance, to have virtual coupling. So trains can couple and uncouple depending on demand. It's fully autonomous. Trains can run together, much closer together, so talk to each other. They have much improved competitiveness that results also in a higher patronage, and there's cost reduction in terms of full knowledge of the status of the network. This is anyway an ideal, and as I said at the beginning, there was a disclaimer there that just treat it with caution, but this is something that it will be nice to aspire to. And those are the sort of the full references of the 4 chapters, acknowledgement of all the authors of this part of the book. So hopefully I kind of recover some of the time that was missing. So if there's any questions, I will be happy to answer them. Just looking at the chat. Flying bus, yeah, maybe. Rockets. Any questions? Any comments, please? No?
Just well, it's a comment, Roberto. I don't know if it was your line or not, but public transport is likely to get long COVID. I think that's
it was my line.
Things
yeah.
well,
yeah.
and I will use that in the future with acknowledgement.
You're welcome.
Of course. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, true. I think it's unfortunately it's quite the evidence looks like that. Unfortunately. Any comments of any views, suggestions? As I said, I'm not from Brooklyn like Matt, but I can talk very fast as well. So hopefully it wasn't too fast. You didn't understand anything that I said in there. As I said, this section is really well integrated like the rest of the book, and they're really easy chapters to read. So I recommend you to have a quick read on that. If there are not any comments or any questions, I think the next thing is a break, isn't it?
Yep, that's right. It's a 10-minute break, so time for coffee, hot chocolate, tea, something stronger in some cases, depending on your location. But please, let's not go too far away and reconvene again in 10 minutes. And thank you to all the facilitators and speakers for this, the first tranche of this marathon session. So see you all shortly.
Thank you.
Good morning from Japan. Good afternoon. Good evening. I have to admit I am only joining now. The time was a bit too nightly for me before. So we're continuing with part C of the handbook. Part C is about public transport environment. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Okay, let me share. Share my screen here. Okay, well, I should first introduce myself very briefly. Yeah? My name is Jan-Dirk Schmocker. I'm working at, I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University and in the Department of Urban Management. And yes, a lot of my research focuses on public transport, on modeling it, as well as recently a lot about data, big data demand estimation, and its connection to other modes, specifically also shared transport. So this part of the book, this part C, has 5 chapters. The first chapter is by Melanie Crane and Christopher Standen on the health impacts of public transport. And this is followed by a chapter by a postdoc in our group, Dr. Ison and myself, on demand estimation for public transport network planning. Then we have a chapter on the first last mile connection to public transport. Fourthly, public transport and the built environment by Murtaza Haider and Ahmed El-Junaidi. I forgot to mention Christopher Venter for the previous chapter. And finally, intelligent mobility and big data for planning, trust and privacy by Caitlin D. Cottrell. So what we want to do in this 30 minutes is I will introduce these chapters briefly, and there will be, as I will soon explain, there will be 2 videos, 1 presentation. But let me first outline a bit what the overall theme here is. So the overall themes of this chapter, very roughly summarized, is first of all the wider impact of public transport. You saw here this chapter on the health impact, but also if we look at public transport and the environment, and if we look at, well, how do we estimate demand for public transport? So how can we quantify the demand for public transport, and then what is the wider impact on it on different dimensions of our activities as well as our health? Secondly, constraints under which the services operate. How does the built environment favor or disfavor public transport in particularly? And then the topic that comes through, I think, through all those chapters is the data issues. And I call this here needs, possibilities, and issues with new data sources. So you will also see, I think, those in all at least many of those chapters, at least 4 or 5 of those chapters, there is a discussion on how the what opportunities these new data bring, but also that we must be careful with them, and furthermore that we ideally want even more data to quantify some of these issues that arise in the chapters. So, in this 30 minutes, there will first be 2 videos. Firstly, I start with a video by Christopher Wendel. And then, unfortunately, well, actually, Murtaza wanted to be with us live, but on very short notice, unfortunately, he had to cancel, but he sent a video instead, which I will play. And then we have Wense presenting live, and I hope after that we have still time for some discussion. Before showing the video sent by Crystal, let me first though make a few words on the first chapter, because I think it's worth it also to set the tone in some sense, and to really show how wide the impact of public transport is. So this chapter summarizes a lot of the or summarizes and reviews the benefits of okay, sorry, I just thought there is the benefits of public transport provision: physical activity, air pollution, road injury and trauma, stress and well-being, access to services, risk of infectious disease, and it discusses the positives and the negatives. So especially if we talk about COVID, we see currently a big discussion also on the possible potential negative impacts of public transport on infectious diseases. But the authors highlight that overall the positives clearly by far outweigh the negatives, but that COVID highlights the need to control the negative. And I think also the 2 research points the authors make are very important. The first one, then, health impacts in low to middle income countries of public transport has not been the topic of much research. And secondly, most of the literature they review is about formal transport and not about informal transport. Okay, so that's that first chapter, and I think we should well, this is certainly something to keep in mind for the ongoing discussion. So with that, let me share with you the first video. By Christopher Wendel. So both of these videos are 5 minutes.
Good day, I am Christo Venter from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and I will briefly take you through the chapter on the first and last mile connection to public transport, which you will see in the handbook. Now, why is there a chapter on the first and last mile in the handbook on public transport? Well, the chapter proceeds from the assumption that the first and last mile is very strongly a public transport issue. Public transport is inherently multimodal. Transport is often the weakest link in this whole multimodal chain. It's often the slowest, the most inconvenient, the most unsafe, and the most physically demanding part of the trip. And for that reason, it is an issue that is clearly critical to the future success of sustainable transport. Now, the first and last mile takes place in a complex and a multi-actor environment with different agencies often responsible for managing street environments versus feeder bus networks versus bicycle infrastructure and so forth. And of course, that makes the management of the first and last mile environment quite difficult. There is at the same time also quite a lot of development in this area with new emerging modes coming up, from on-demand shuttles to micro-mobility and shared modes and so on, which is also fast changing the first and last mile. Now, the chapter briefly looks at the research that is available on the first and last mile quality And those factors include things like the distance of the first and last mile trip, walkability of the first and last mile environment. So for instance, there are quite a few walkability assessment tools that are available for assessing the quality of walkability, and also research that's looked at the link between walking behavior and the built environment. Similarly, bicycle compatibility has seen quite a lot of work. There's research on personal factors that drive people's assessment of the first and last mile. There's some research and tools to look at the role of the first and last mile in the overall accessibility that people get from using a public transport to their destination. And then lastly, of course, the quality of the actual transfer facilities that people have to use. What we find is that there is no single tool that's actually able to integrate across these different modes and specifically look at their connectivity to a public transport trip. So the next part of the chapter then sets out to develop a better measure for first and last mile quality that's essentially route-based, and develops an index that takes into account both the user's needs and priorities around the first and last mile, as well as the actual quality of those first and last mile elements. And it was tested using a case study in the Tshwane, Johannesburg area, with the walking and feeder bus as the two first and last mile modes, and that connects to a commuter rail system in this area. So the first step that's reported on was a survey that looks at what people actually want and what the attributes are that should be considered in such an index. And things that came out quite strongly were the importance of safety from crime, the importance of the cost of the access trip, and then lastly, thirdly, the comfort of waiting areas and the time and distance of the access trip. So based on these results, we then developed a visual auditing method that's really based on literature to go and score these different attributes for these first and last mile trips, and weight each of them according to the results that we've just explained. And the results really show quite a variation in first and last mile quality across the different access and egress routes that we identified. There were about 300 routes that were selected in this way. And so lastly, then some emerging questions. There is a need to collect better data on the first and last mile trip. Much of our smart car data, of course, misses the first and last mile trip. So we need to think about ways of understanding that better from a data perspective. Then the role of new technologies, of course, those are changing the landscape, and we need to understand better how they create new opportunities and also new barriers in the first and last mile environment. And then lastly, what are the intersections between the first and last mile quality and how people use public transport? What are their perspectives and how that affects behavior, and also aspects such as equity and sustainability. Those are issues that are really in need of future research.
Okay, so this was the video from Crystal. Thank you to him in absence. If you have comments on this and remarks, I maybe ask you now to hold them. I think we will have some time in the end to discuss. Let me show you first the second video. The second video is by Murtaza Haider on the built environment. Here we go.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present these findings from our chapter in the book, Public Transport and the Built Environment. My name is Murtaza Haider, and I'm presenting this on behalf of my co-author, Ahmed Al-Ghanedi, and myself. Essentially, we are looking at the enablers of public transit use. The characteristics of built environment are notably known as density, design, and diversity, the famous Cervera-Kokelman paper. But we also know, and the research since then has shown, that not any one of these elements are sufficient. You need a combination of these and then some. And also these enabling attributes are correlated, which is there's multicollinearity, for example, where there's population density is high, so is road density. So some design elements get associated with density. And so it's very difficult to isolate the impact of one or the other. And also there's this self-selection bias for people who are likely to travel by public transport will self-sort themselves into neighborhoods that are more supportive of transit use. So it's very difficult, or at least challenging, to find the real enablers of transit use as far as built environment is concerned, or demographics or personal predispositions to the use or of public transit or otherwise. So in this chapter, we were interested in answering the question, or addressing the question, why most urban commuters don't travel by public transit when transit enabling built environment exists. And this is true for places like Toronto, where I live, or Montreal, where we have all forms of public transport, for example, subways, buses, streetcars, and whatnot. And then still, most trips are made by non-transit modes. And when you account for vehicle kilometers traveled, again, automobile is by far much ahead. So why is that the case? And when we thought about it, we realized that some of the things that matter are the transit is better for sure for environment and for other reasons, but it's slower. The average commute times are slower. So I'm going to present briefly more about this in this 5-minute presentation. The other thing is neighborhood vintage matters. So when we do cross urban comparisons, we believe, or we don't account for the age of the neighborhoods. And we found that even new neighborhoods in transit-friendly older cities, and we found that older cities have higher transit use, but even new neighborhoods in older cities do not have much higher transit use. And if you compare the new neighborhoods in old cities with neighborhoods in new cities, you don't find much difference in transit use. So neighborhood vintage, we often don't account for in the built environment, is something that we would like to see more of it. And then the question we ask is, can built environment of existing places be modified to support transit use? And the answer is, once the neighborhood is paved over, it's quite difficult to reimagine it and repave it into a built form that is supportive of transit use. So I think starting afresh, we can do better. We can build cities better so we don't have transit auto-dependent communities and cities, but doing re-engineering existing cities could be difficult. So some of the findings that I want to share with you in the next 2-3 minutes is that, when we look at data from Canada, we find that even cities with transit systems, higher density and whatnot, we still have transit rides on average longer than by automobile. So if you look at this is figure 23.1 in our book chapter. In Calgary, for example, the average commute time for public transport are much higher, and probably 70% higher in Calgary. And if you look at Montreal, it's still 60% or more higher. In Toronto, again, so the average commute time by public transit is 60% longer and then the average commute times by public transit. So if travel budgets are of concern, then yes, a car could be the reason why people are gravitating to it. And it's not just Canada. If you look at the US, you see this is data of the core-based statistical areas in the US. You see as population density increases, so does the public transport mode share. It's a universal finding that doesn't change much. But if you look at the other element of it, and you see that public transit mode share, as it increases, so does the commute time. So yes, density helps with transit use, but transit use increases, and so you see an increase in average commute times that is associated with it. So it's not as simple as we thought. And the other thing is the neighborhood vintage. If you compare a more established city like Montreal with a population of and where this is like the Montreal census metropolitan area, and the labor force is about 1.8 million in the area. Calgary, 684,000 workers. Public transit mode split for the entire census metropolitan areas. Montreal much higher for commute trips, so work trips 25% compared to Calgary, which is 14.5. But if you compare the old neighborhoods, you see Montreal's old neighborhoods have twice as much larger mode split than Calgary, but when you compare the new neighborhoods, the transit mode splits are almost similar. And if you compare the new neighborhoods between the two cities, actually Calgary, which is not known for its density, has higher population density in newer neighborhoods than in Montreal. So the last slide I'm presenting today is that if you take all of Canada, and it's about 500,000 neighborhoods across Canada, and you categorize them in low, medium, and high density, you will realize that the high density neighborhoods that are supportive or thought of being supportive of public transit use, they're roughly fewer than 3% of entire Canada. So that's the challenge that we have, that at the current built form, the transit supportive land use or built environment is very small, and I think the future of future construction should be such that we build cities that support transit use, mobility by transit, and non-motorized modes. But with the existing cities, that would be a challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Murtaza for this video. And I think if we look at that together, this challenge that he outlined here very clearly, and the health impacts, I think we have a true challenge combining these two. So now the live presentation by Wense. And Wense, I hope you're ready. Yep.
Yeah. Greeting from Japan. My name is Wense Sun. I'm working with Jan-Dirk in Kyoto University, a laboratory of intelligent transport systems. So I will give an overview on chapter 21. So this chapter brings a discussion on demand estimation for public transport network planning. So that we start this chapter with a classic framework for public transport network planning, which was originally proposed by Seto and contests for steps: network design, timetable development, vehicle scheduling, and crew scheduling. So this chapter notes that the demand estimates are critical determinants for the first and second steps, which is network design and timetable development. Next, we distinguish demand estimation for new service and existing service. So for new service, this problem is to forecast the demand attracted to a service from other modes or generated by better transport service. So usually conventional four-step modeling is used. The model inputs are map data like land use information and population data. A review on traditional methods or multi-agent methods and emerging deep learning methods like graph convolution networks can be found in this chapter. For existing service, we can more straightforward draw the demand estimates from public transports or transit datasets. We classify demand into 3 levels: stop-based demand, which includes boarding flows, alighting flows, and loads at stops. Second is lagged OD, which is OD metrics for single bus routes or transit routes. In this illustration, Q means the OD flows from stop I to stop J. Then if we aggregate the OD flows by origin and destination stop, we can have boarding flows and alighting flows for each stop. The third level is journey OD, which put emphasis on the true origin stop and the destination stop from standpoint of the user. It may involve multiple routes in a multimodal public transport network. Estimation on this may be only possible with smart cards. So in this illustration, we can see 4 transactions. With algorithm and the rules, we can spotlight the true origin and the destination, as well as the intermediate stations for transfer. So speaking of transit data, there are 3 major passive transit data sets: automatic vehicle location data, automatic passenger counting data, and automatic fare collection data. So AVL is designed to track the vehicle information, the temporal and the spatial information of the transit vehicles. It's indirect for demand estimation, but it can link a passenger enter exit station gates to a specific vehicle with the egress and exit time. APC data and AFC data provide more direct and straightforward demand observations. So APC data captures boarding and alighting passenger at each stop, which enables us to replicate stop-based demand components. Some effective approaches using APC data to estimate lag OD are also discussed in the chapter. AFC data furthermore connects boarding and alighting stop for each user. We can naturally feed these linked entries to a matrix. Sometimes the boarding or alighting stop is missing due to system issues, like for transit routes of flat fare structure, it only requires payments at boarding and alighting. So it is necessary to first infer the origin and the destination station and then build the OD matrix. In addition, AFC data provide opportunity for us to understand journey OD, and good reading materials for this problem and these scientific advancements are introduced in this chapter. Finally, we propose a question like, if it's possible to obtain demand estimates if an operator only has AVL data. It says the fact in Japan that operators do not always have access to AFC data, although many people use smart card. It's also helpful for the systems where APC and AFC data are not available, such as an open system. You just show the path and disappear in the system, as we cannot track the user. So as we mentioned, AVL data is not designed for demand estimation. However, we think draw times in which the passengers interact with the vehicle are indicating important demand information. Therefore, we attach a latest finding by our group on using draw times to estimate boarding floors, alighting floors, passenger loads, and OD floors to this chapter. A Bayesian framework is used, taking draw times as the observation and demand components as the unknown parameters. We can say that this method succeeds in the estimation on alighting floors and the boarding loads in view of the acceptable estimation accuracy. But the boarding floors and OD floors at several stops are misestimated. This can be addressed by adding boarding counts of a few bus runs as additional observation to this Bayesian framework. The accuracy of OD estimation in terms of R-square is improved from 0.4 to 0.6 by adding boarding counts of one bus run, to 0.8 if the number of bus runs increased to 5. So finally, is a summary of this chapter and some future challenges. We want to note that two challenges. One is regarding demand forecasting for network change, or if disruption occurs, a gap still remains between the approach discussed in the chapter, because the majority of studies use big PT data to rebuild the demand. Second is that this chapter may discuss the estimation and demand size, the number of passengers. Inference on PT trap purpose can also fall into the domain of demand estimation. For example, the purpose split of passengers visiting the railway station, what's POIs, what place they come for, a restaurant or just for transfer. And the inference becomes promising with a combination of transit data, map data, and the mobile phone data. It's unnecessary to be a very disaggregated level mobile phone data, which also will maybe concern the privacy. So it can be also like aggregated mobile phone data provided by Google service, like the Google Popular Times, are provided by many mobile phone vendor, mobile phone network providers. Like in Japan, Docomo NTT provides some aggregated population distribution for the city, like splitting the zone in the city into 100 kilometer square zones and provided the population for these zones 24 hours. Yeah, that's all from me. Over to you, Jan-Dirk.
Thank you, sir. We are almost at the end of the session, but I still want to share. Sorry, we didn't leave much time for discussion, but let me still share you my final slide with some notes, which. So the last chapter in this book, looked then more at the privacy issues that arise also with big data. And I have here some points that I maybe want you to take away overall from this book section, which I think it highlights well. One, as Wenz also mentioned, it's this potential of big data, and that we can use rough big data such as AVL data to then refine, for example, our demand estimates. But we also need this data to actually better, not just for demand estimation and service planning, which I think we always think first of, but also for the quantification of wider benefits, such as health benefits. Also, there is a lot of different types of big data. We went to talk about AVL, AFC, APC, but we think there is much more data beyond that. And obviously, we need data that was also highlighted in this section. I think, for example, these data don't tell us much about the first and last mile. If we have information, how do people select actually their choices? When do they do it? Where do they do it? And can we have citywide indicators also from other big data sources that we can then combine with these AVL, AFC data to actually see, for example, the impact of sales in an area that rise or fall depending on public transport. And then also, well, with this issue of data privacy, so when do we actually need individual data, and when is actually aggregate data sufficient? Not just for data privacy, but also for analysis complexity. I think very often this discussion would be very useful. So those were my thoughts on it. And well, it's 7:02. If you have any final comments. Sorry for not leaving much time for you to make comments. I see here one in the chat. But if not, then the next person can take over. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm the next person. I'm Bavarian.
Sorry,
It's all right. Sorry, it's all right. I'm Bavarian from Taiwan, and good morning for everyone from Taiwan, and also good afternoon, good evening for everyone in other place. Okay, let me share my screen. I have made small slides for my presenters. No, not this one. Sorry for that. Is anyone see my Word file? Yes? Yes, okay.
Yep.
Good. All right, so basically for this section, I think it's technically speaking, the section 4, and we are talking about Schmocker data. In this section, I have arranged 3 speakers because I think it gives us a very nice story about how we use this data and what's the concept about the Schmocker data usage, and it's an overview. So the first part will be introduced by Dr. Chin Ho, and he is presenting basically the first chapter of the Schmocker section, that's section 5. And he will provide the overview of how this kind of new data from coming in terms of public transport planning. And followed by a case study that will be presented by Dr. Jeffrey Clifton. There is 2 case studies actually, because I'm too lazy to present my own part. And I think that it's have very similar method with Jeffrey's method. So I asked Jeffrey to also present my results, so I don't have to reintroduce the repeating stuff. And the third presenter is Professor Toshi Yamamoto. He is going to present another case study from Japan. I think this will give us a very nice flow introduction and to case study. Finally, I hope we can have some time for Q&A. If you don't, I do have some difficult questions for them. But we would hold on there to see do we have some time for it. As for the presentation method, since we already have a video, so we decided to have advantage for it. So for the first and the third one, we're going to go for the video form. And for the Jeffrey, he said that he wants to do that in person. Is of course fine. So if we don't have a further question, I'm going to play the video for us. And we also have other authors be part of this section, but unfortunately we only have 30 minutes. So we only include 3% presentation. For others, if you are interested about the book chapter, of course, go buy the book. This is a very nice book. Okay.
Good day, everyone, and thank you.
And can everyone see the video? Yes?
No, we cannot see that.
Okay, let me reshare it again. Can you see the video?
Yes. Good afternoon. I am Jin Ho, Senior Lecturer at the University of Sydney. In this short video, I would like to give you an overview of smart car data used in public transport research. I also take a chance to show you an example application of what we did with the Opel car smart car data here in Sydney. So to begin with, smart car data have been used in transport research for many different purposes, ranging from customer service to marketing to network planning and service adjustment. The use of smart car data underlies a large body of research with literally thousands of journal articles. So it is really tricky to summarize their many different use, particularly in a 5-minute presentation like this one. So what I did here is to adopt an STO framework to classify the rich literature of smart car data according to their contribution being strategic, tactical, or operational. So at the strategic level, smart car data are used for long-term plannings. We can find many studies that try to understand or establish the travel pattern or travel habit of the customer, from which the output could be used to perform demand forecasting for the future. A typical example that we find in many studies are the estimation of the origin destination matrix, an input in many of the strategic travel demand model, which is used for strategic planning of transport infrastructure. At a tactical level, smart car data are used mainly to improve service through timetable and network planning. We find many studies that try to understand the variation in ridership, temporally and spatially, and the aim is to try to improve the customer service through, for example, an integrated service across different routes and also across different modes of public transport. Many examples that we can find in the literature that try to track the user or customer movement along a public transport network, to which I'm going to show you one example in the next slide. But basically, we try to understand the journey of every single customer and try to understand the pain point that they go through and aim to address them to improve the customer experience. Finally, smart car data can be used for operational purpose to perform short-term adjustment to the timetable or to the network. Typically, smart car data are used to compute a detailed performance indicator or set of indicators ranging from the punctuality or on time of different routes or service, deriving the monthly or weekly ridership, can substitute as one for the ultimate vehicle location data if we do have them, and the journey planner data in order to develop a passenger to train assignment model. So the output of this model can be used in many different purposes, such as monitoring the crowding on trains, platforms, and stations. So on the left, we have 3-minute trail of every train that we can find in Sydney during the morning peak hour. And on the right, the crowding profile for a toll station, a toll platform at the central station. That's it. I hope that you can learn something from this short video. Good day, everyone, and thank you for tuning in.
I think that's our first video, and sorry for the middle of the time losing the video thing, because I thought I shouldn't show my voice. Sorry about that. Anyhow, so next part will be Jeffrey. Jeff?
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm just sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see the presentation full screen now. Excellent. Well, I'm be presenting on chapters 35 and 36, which are looking at applications of the methodology which Chin has just described to Sydney, chapter 35, and chapter 36, Brisbane in Australia. So I'd say this methodology, as I said, was developed by Chin, and for the Sydney data was implemented by Low and Ho. I want to thank them as well. So as you would have heard, the wait times are calculated as the GTFS expected departure time minus the tap-on time from smart card data for 1 day. The average headway is then calculated over the next 3 departures after the next departure time after tap-on, but only evenly spaced departure times were used. So the point of this methodology was to compare what people wait, how long people wait for their service against the actual scheduled departure time. We were able to identify that in both cities, there are regular headways that are used for most of the train services. And that was determined, as I said, by looking at the evenly spaced departure times following the tap-on time. In Sydney, 25% of train trips require a transfer at an intermediate station, and those itineraries were inferred from the trip planner data based on the generalized travel time, which was calculated as inter-platform time plus weighted waiting time, weighted number of transfers, and weighted egress time. And the data then was analyzed by time of day and by headway. Here's an example from Sydney. Now, purely random arrivals would lead to 50% of passengers arriving within half the average headway, with the other 50% of passengers waiting more than half the average headway. We hypothesize that you'll see some schedule-dependent people who expect to arrive there, who match their expected arrival time against the expected departure time of the train. If all passengers were schedule dependent, then the percentage of people who arrive within half the headway would be close to or equal to 100%. But that's not quite what we see. And you can see here that as you go down this chart, the headway between services increases. You see, as you get beyond about 10 minutes of headway, most people are arriving within 50%, within the first few minutes of the departure time. But at lower headways, you do see people arriving more randomly. We can analyze this a little bit more closely, and here's the data for Brisbane. There were 3 different service headways: 7 minutes, 15 minutes, and 30 minutes. We'll take 7 minutes as an example, as you can see on this table here. This table shows the possible waiting times for a 7-minute headway, so 0 minutes through to 6 minutes of waiting time. If passengers arrived randomly, then we would expect 57% of passengers would arrive in up to 3 minutes. That's the yellow cell down there. but the actual proportion is only about 7%, the green number. The Z-score for this is 143, shown in blue, which means that we can strongly reject the null hypothesis. And in fact, half of the passengers wait up to 5 minutes for their service. So passengers are likely in Brisbane to arrive very early for their service. It's possibly related to schedule unreliability or just a general preference to be early. Again, with the Brisbane data, we can see the arrival pattern and the median waiting time for each of the service headways, 7, 15 and 30 minutes between services. The proportion of passengers who arrive within half the headway is, as you can see, very low at all headways. This suggests that passengers in South East Queensland do not arrive randomly, as said before. According to the median waiting time, passengers have significant longer waiting times than half the headway, though at least thankfully you can see there that as the headway increases, the median does increase, but not quite as much. So they're at least matching their arrival time to the departure time to some extent. Here's the distribution for Sydney now. And what we've got here is time of day. So before 7 a.m, morning peak is in the second row, where interpeak is in the third row, and so on. And against the headway. You can see with the green, with the green highlighted cells for 3 minutes, you'll see about 50% of passengers arrive within half the headway when it's a 3-minute frequency, which suggests that at those frequencies, people are arriving randomly. On the other hand, when we've got 15 minutes or greater, more than half passengers arrive within half the waiting time, so people are matching their arrival times to the departure times. So there are some differences by time of day. Notice in the evening, people are random even up to 10 minutes. But so somewhere between 10 minutes or around the 10-minute frequency mark is the point at which most people switch to arriving randomly, which is in accord with the 10 to 15 minutes defined for frequent network in Sydney, which is, in Australia, 10 to 15 minutes usually defines a frequent service, which is a good thing to see. But it tends to be, and what the next steps would be to try and model this as a mixture of two probability distributions, arrival randomly or schedule dependent. Okay. Yeah, I'll finish there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And we have our last presenter. There will be Professor Yamamoto's presentation. Let me try this time to see, can I make it smoother? Okay, let me share my screen again. Can everyone see the video? Yes. Can everyone hear that?
Of passenger travel patterns observed using smart card data in Japan, authored by Sasha Liu and Toshiyuki Nakamura. Regularity and variability in human mobility are important for understanding urban dynamics. Smart card data enable continuous observation using a large sample size. Smart card data in Shizuoka, Japan, contains social demographic information, including age and gender. So, regularity and variability of travel patterns are investigated in this study, considering the social demographic differences as well as care types. This figure shows study area. Shizutetsu Group is the main public transport operator in this area, having one railway line with 15 stations and bus networks with approximately 1,600 bus stops. We use the Rulka card in this area, and then more than 90% of passengers pay for their trips by registered Ruruka card in this area. Then we collected data from April 1st of 2018 to March 31st, 2019. On the left-hand side, you can see the average daily boarding ridership across months. Then we have a smaller number for the summer vacation season, August, and then the year end, the beginning of the year in January. On the right-hand side, we have variability across days of week. We have a smaller number of passengers on weekends and also a slightly lower ridership at Monday because of the Happy Monday system in Japan. In the methodology, we use the DB scan algorithm to extract the pattern for temporal pattern, and then for spatial pattern, we use OD pairs, and then we aggregated locations within 750 meters as one location. For spatial temporal pattern, we use entropy measures by the literature. This shows the results of temporal patterns. You can see that the high peak period for the weekdays and then lower peak at on the weekend. Moreover, larger irregular trips during the period between 10 to 15, and then larger proportion of irregular trips on weekends than weekdays. This shows the result of spatial patterns. And on the left-hand side, you can see that most of the trips were made between the top two OD pairs, which is consistent with the literature. And then males have more concentrated active locations compared to females. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that the elderly, age 65 or higher, have more diverse activity spaces. This shows the results of spatial temporal patterns by entropy. Then you can see that elderly has diverse patterns, while small children has the smallest entropy. And then working age commuter pass holders have smaller entropy than non-pass holders, while elderly monthly pass holders have higher entropy than non-pass holders. It is really different from the working age. This shows the conclusion. A male and child have more regular spatial temporal travel patterns, while elderly has more diverse patterns. Monthly pass possibly encourages elderly to engage in diverse spatial temporal travel patterns. Finally, a flexible fare system can be developed by including age-specific monthly pass and commuter passes with multiple destinations. Thank you.
All right, this is all our three presentations, and I think we still have several minutes. Before we start the Q&A, I would like to thank you to the three presenters because they do help a lot and explain the concept very, very well. And I think they can give us quite a good beginning start or whatever you think in your mind about the big data. All right. Do we have any questions? Professor Yamamoto, there is a question for you.
Yes, about the subscription system. In Japan, operated by private companies, and then they limit the commuting pass for the predetermined one OD pairs. And then commuters have to pay for the different types of trips and then different destinations. partly because the commuter pass is subsidized by the company, right? So the company is paying the employees to commute only, not for the leisure trips or some other trips. May I answer your questions? Thank you.
Any others? Even though Professor Yamamoto, may I have my one personal question? What's a happy Monday? What's the Monday?
Sorry. Japanese government moved the holidays to the Monday. If it is not so important holiday, I mean, so the people can enjoy 3 days, weekend to encourage the vacation trips or something. But not now. COVID may change everything.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Oh, we might need to suggest that to our government as well. Anyhow, any other? Do we have other questions?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but I think it would be a very nice suggestion. I put it on the chat for Professor Yamamoto. It's maybe nice to actually look at a follow-up study to see how the entropy actually changed given COVID situation, because here in Sydney, we got 2/3 of the new skies are due to the young people moving around the community. Now we are in lockdown. So maybe a follow-up study would be nice.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. The commuting or not, and also age-specific response to the COVID situation. Thank you.
I have a feeling like smart card data for all you guys are very easy to get. We try very hard to dig out 6 months card data from Taiwan, and government just refuse to release any more new cards. So that's my biggest obstacle for that. Otherwise, follow-up stuff during COVID would be really, really nice and interesting. Okay, thank you for the comment and the suggestions. Last chance, last call. And now we're going to move to the next person. John, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara, and contributors to the smart card session. Okay, I only have just a very few closing remarks to bring to an end what I think I described earlier as this marathon session. We've been operating across multiple time zones encompassing the central time. We nicknamed it Texas time whilst we were doing the preparation in the US, right across to Sydney, and it's been wonderful to have so many contributors, both for the book itself and for the session today. Now, because of the time differences, I wasn't in the first session. It was a little bit too early for me to join from Sydney. But I don't know if there's anyone still with us who was online almost 4 hours ago. But Corinne and Steve just briefly set the scene, and just wanted to very quickly just rehearse some of those numbers from what has been really quite a fascinating and rewarding exercise. 43 chapters, 63 authors, 19 countries. We've set out our research agenda. I'm not rehearsing it now. We're all well versed in that. We've covered a breadth of subjects. We've attempted to look at how innovation has been incorporated in the past and continues to be an important feature of the public transport agenda. When I stop talking in just a moment, I would be interested to hear if anyone has suggestions of what we may have overlooked or perhaps what we might have done differently. As various speakers highlighted, we did ask authors to identify areas for further research at the end of their chapters. And I think that has been very effective. And because of the timing of the pandemic, sorry to mention it again, it actually arrived midway through the writing project. It did, however, provide us with the opportunity for authors to reflect on what was then known about COVID. So this is actually 12 months now has elapsed since we actually finished off the chapters, and how that was influencing their thinking around particularly alternative futures for public transport. And I think that has been an effective feature of today's session as well, just to hear from the various authors about their views with respect to COVID-19. I mentioned after Roberto was speaking on the future, just before the break, that I really liked his term. Didn't like the implications, but I liked his term that public transport is likely to get long COVID, and I think that is something for us to reflect on. So let me just finish with a few words of thanks again, as my co-editors did at the beginning. Thank you to all of our authors. Thank you to our publisher. Thank you also to Cara, a chapter co-author, but also the person who suggested that we might incorporate this session in the BTR conference, and thank you also to Fatima for providing the technical support for today. So we just have a few moments if anybody would like to make any comments, offer any reflections. Again, as one of the presenters did say earlier, I forget who it was, but please don't forget to order the book for your libraries, or perhaps purchase a personal copy as well. The URL was on the slide I had there, but you'll also find it via any good search engine. So just for those who remain, any final comments, any suggestions of other topics or aspects that we should pick up? Okay, it's quiet. That may perhaps suggest that we did a good job. It's also reflective of possibly also of the various stages of the morning, afternoon, or evening in which people find themselves.